Still waiting here. It's loading. Okay, I think we're live.
Awesome.
So it says we have an excellent connection. So I'm here live tonight with my friend Basic Thoughts. We met just last night on Twitter. We were just having a conversation about things like systemic racism, Elizabeth Warren, and things like that. And I thought it was a good conversation, and I really thank you, Basic Thoughts, for coming on and being willing to be on the show with me. So,
sure thing. It's great to be here.
all right. So yeah, we can start with that topic. We were kind of discussing whether or not the narrative of white institutional, and please correct me if I'm misrepresenting your views or what, not even necessarily your views, what we were discussing last night though, that like white systemic racism exists and it's largely responsible for the numbers we see of like what we would consider success rates among races. So like employment, education levels, incarceration levels, and things like that. Do you think that's...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would say like greater than 50% responsible or not, but just it's a factor worth considering, I guess. Like worth doing something about, maybe, is what I would say.
Okay. Yeah, and you know, it's funny, and this goes to show something we were talking about before we came on. It goes to show how the platform of Twitter is really bad for having conversations with people because you tend to get defensive, and it's hard to say what you... It's hard to have a nuanced thought. It's easy to just put bulletin point stuff out there. So I kind of agree with that, despite it seems like we were disagreeing last night. I think that you can say that they're to me, it's I don't think either of us would debate that systemic racism at least existed in the past. Clearly, slavery, Jim Crow, things like that, and that would affect people today, or that could still affect people today. You would agree with that, I'd assume.
Right. Yeah. I would probably say, like, I don't know. There's like different people use like kind of different definitions. So like sometimes you'll hear people say, like people like on the left or whatever, they'll say stuff like, oh, racism is still the main thing today, and it's like responsible for everything. And if you have a different definition of racism, then you might be like, well, hold on, like that's ridiculous. Like there's not tons of people driving by in trucks telling you to go back to Africa and stuff like that. But I think that a lot of the misconceptions that arise between like people on the right and the left and stuff like that is just because of like a difference in the definition. So like they might, when other people say like racism, they might mean, I think, like the total sum of everything that has ever occurred and is still occurring. So like they might, when they say racism is like the cause of all this, they might mean like, well, systemic racism and any effect that like came about as a result of any racism that has ever happened or something, very broad like that. Like I've seen a lot of people have a lot of different definitions about racism. So I guess right off the bat, maybe that might be like a point of contention, is just there's just different definitions available.
And I think that's where a lot of our disagreement was last night. And I'll kind of elaborate what like, for example, I think we could look at statistics and say, you could make this argument, and I'll ask you if you agree with me, that we have a systemic system that's set to disadvantage poor people. Like, would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Now, the question is, I wouldn't call that system bigotry towards the poor. I would just say, and by that I mean, I guess when I'm using a word like racism or bigotry, I'm assuming intent. So I'm assuming, and maybe you can tell me if when I hear a lot of people talk about we still have systemic racism in these communities, to me, and then especially once you start talking about like, well, it was built by white people and it was to keep white people at the top, and so it's white systemic racism. By the way, I'm not saying you're making this argument. I'm just saying I've heard this. To me, that implies intent. But the more I thought about it last night, you could make the argument, well, no, it's not that white people set it up intentionally. It's just like it happened that way, even if it wasn't intentional. So I don't know if you were trying to say something like that, or you could elaborate on them.
So I think like right now, I don't think there's too much I don't think there's an element of intent like that's very visible like right now, in the sense that I don't think there's a lot of people standing around like saying or talking to their peers like, how do we like suppress black people and stuff like that. I don't think there's a whole bunch of people sitting around doing that, but there might be a bunch of people sitting around thinking like, how can we continue to like, monopolize, benefit from this advantage that we have not referencing black people or anything, but just like, oh, there's a bunch of people that aren't that well off, and I'm kind of well off, and I want to just know how to maximize my riches. But which is in kind of what we might call a fair like capitalist society, that's like just kind of a normal
right.
Darwinian type of thing to do, except for the fact that like people who are playing the game of comics and stuff, not everybody started off on the same foot, and so because there's a whole bunch of blacks at the bottom of the ladder, a lot more so than there are whites, like proportionally speaking. Because of that, the blacks are saying like, well, hold on, you started most of us out with like not enough money to even play. Like what, how is this a fair game? How can you claim this is a fair game when you basically kind of screwed us from the start? I think that's kind of maybe a fair take on it. I don't know.
But so, and I get that, and I know I understand that this is what a lot of people say. But some of the things, I'm willing to hear that systemic racism exists. My question is, when we look at these statistics, what are the main motivators for why they are the way they are? One of the things is, and I think it's important to start off, and I'm confident, I haven't known you very long, but I bet you'll agree with me on this. I think that even if we have disagreements, we want all of these communities to do better. If it was up to us, we'd want everyone to be doing great, regardless of skin color. So we both want the same thing. We're looking at a problem, saying, why are some communities falling behind, and saying, hey, what are the reasons for it? How can we fix it? I think you would agree with that.
Right. Yeah, and I've seen a lot of people like converse about this topic just online and stuff. Like I've heard like David Pacman and Destiny and a bunch of people on the IDW kind of talk about this, and they all have like a whole bunch of different opinions. Like, I mean, obviously people like Ben Shapiro are going to have one opinion. Like I'm pretty sure that he believes that just it's not a thing anymore or something.
Right.
I think that's his opinion. But then like other people like Sam Harris, I think. I don't know if you ever listened to him.
Yeah, I like Sam. Yep.
Yeah, I like him too. I think he has like a drastically kind of different view, and he's left wing.
Yes,
of course.
Yeah,
but
go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
Go on. No, I was just continuing.
So we have that goal, and so my question is, what is driving? So what is our ideas of what's driving that? So, like, one of the things I would say is that what we were talking about last night with the Asians. Now, I think we came to the conclusion that I have to be honest. I can't say Asians disproved the supposition or the narrative that systemic racism, particularly in the past, is what's a large driver of these numbers today. But I think it kind of speaks against that argument some, even if it's not dispositive proof. And the reason is because we see that Asian Americans, there was, particularly in California, there were acts specifically passed to say you can't hire Asians. Now, I wouldn't make the argument that they were treated as bad as African Americans, obviously. But the fact is, it's not like they're doing just a little better than African Americans. They're doing better than whites. And so I think that shows there has to be something else going on. So even if I could concede systemic racism maybe has something to do with it, there has to be another factor.
Right. So I think that there might be two ways to kind of approach this. One way might be like we just kind of, even if we don't agree with like all of them, we should maybe just list out everything that we possibly think it could be. Like every reason that we possibly think could exist for this. Like systematic discrimination would be one. Maybe like actual racism would be another, and then I'm not saying you believe any of the other stuff, but like some people say like, oh well, it's a genetic thing, right. It's a cultural thing, it's this thing. I mean, I don't really buy into that as much, but like we should list out all the different factors that we think are even possible, and then we can maybe like work from there, or
right. Yeah,
or and just like talk about Asians.
No, I don't mind that, and obviously this is a discussion where probably much smarter people than us have discussed it at much greater length. But I do think it's worth talking about. Real quick, that's my buddy Drone Tech that's chatting with us there on the chat. I don't know if you can see it, but he wanted. He was saying that he would probably like to have you on his show if you would be interested. So I could set you up with him later, but I just wanted to mention that. So yeah, there's other factors. The IQ, the race realism stuff is a really difficult thing to broach. But I'll just say my feelings on it from the get-go is I don't think that any statistics or anything you talk about that has a factual database is racist. I think how you use that facts is racist. right? So you could say, blacks age 16 to 25 commit, a disproportional amount of homicides. But if you use that to say, like, I really want to solve that problem, what can we do? That's one thing. If you use that to say, that's why I don't want black people living next to me, then that's racist. So it's all in what you decide to do with those stats. So we could talk about the race realism thing, but like some of the I agree. This is exactly the conversation we need to have. It's what are all the factors? So we could lay it on the table that systemic racism could be one of those factors, but I think there's all sorts of other things, and we could, for now we could just leave genetics off it. So like there's cultural situations. There's the fact that it's a lot of poverty, but not just poverty. I think one of the things that's overlooked in like black communities is because they're in cities, you actually have incredible wealth disparity because cities end up having the wealthiest people. And then when you have these ghettos, that's like the poorest people. So that's kind of a double slap in your face. And then you're so compacted with people living shoulder to shoulder. Where I'm at in rural Pennsylvania, there are poor people that might have very similar economic situations to someone in inner city Chicago, per se. But we're kind of spaced out. And there's it's not as a tightly contested battle for resources, I guess, to put it in a really simplistic way. So with a bunch of factors like that, I deplore the people that are just like, oh, it's because blacks are more violent. No, I disagree. There's a lot of good reasons why things are happening in that situation. And one of the things I always say is, I will guarantee you, if I grew up in the inner city in Chicago, whatever my skin color was, if I was born this, white, black, Hispanic, it doesn't matter. I'm weak. I would have got into criminality to try to escape that. I would have got together with people like in a gang that I thought had my back. I know that. I think some of the best Americans we have are people that grew up in these communities and achieved despite of that. To me, that's awesome. To have every disadvantage and to achieve in spite of that, I think is an incredible thing.
Yeah, I definitely think that's good. And that kind of brings up an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't even like the word, but like there's this like whole privilege concept, right? Which is another one of those words, kind of like systemic racism, that might have people have way different definitions. I kind of eventually, talking to a friend, worked out kind of a good definition for it that kind of like makes me feel good, I guess. But like, I'm saying this, I don't know if I'll be able to reproduce it, but
no. Go ahead. Sorry.
My internet.
Oh, you're good. We can hear you now.
Okay, good. Okay. My definition that like I think mostly agrees with the type of message that like the SJW type people are trying to get across, while not sounding like kind of crazy, I guess, is that, privilege can best be interpreted as something like and it's I guess not something that you would say something like, oh, you have white privilege, like situation dependent. So like you would never say like you have white privilege. You would always say like you have white privilege with regards to like this specific situation or something like that. So like, I don't know. I feel like
that is amazing. I've never heard any. I can't say that. I can't remember ever hearing anyone else say that. That's exactly how I feel. When I would be in debate, you would oftentimes hear, "You're white. You should forfeit this round because you have white privilege to help minorities advance further in this activity," and things like that, which I deplored because to me, it's a debate is a game of ideas. Who we are as individuals should be irrelevant to that, unless it, anyways, it's not worth getting into. But yes, you're exactly right. So for example, I could concede that if you're dealing with a police officer, it's probably privileged to be white in general. Not every time, but in general, right? I agree with that. Yeah. But if you are if you're dealing with academia and you're applying for college, or you're trying, in that type of world, it actually is privileged to be black. Now, what I mean by that is, I don't mean more blacks get in. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying if you have the same skill set and you're white and you're black, it is a privilege to be black in as far as because there's less represented, they want you in as more representative. I feel the same way in politics. I think that even though there certainly had to be people that voted against Obama because he was black, I don't think it was many, because I think most people with that attitude probably weren't voting Democrat anyways. But I definitely think it drive turnout for certain people to have their first black president. So I thought that was, but the point is, even if you agree or disagree with those suppositions, you're absolutely right. It's situational. There might be, depending on where you are, what type of situation you're in, you can have different privileges being a woman, being a man, being straight, being gay. It all depends. And I think that when you make blanket statements about this group is privileged, studies show. I don't know if you follow Jonathan Haidt at Heterodox Academy.
Yeah, he's one of my favorites because he doesn't seem that biased.
Right. And it seems, I think it was him, I could be wrong, or it was Christina Hoff Sommers, one of them, that I was reading, that they did a report that said, actually, when you talk about unconscious bias and things like that, and white privilege in places of work, this was just done in places of work where they do the unconscious bias training. There's no evidence that it increases sympathy or understanding for poor blacks. It actually increases animosity towards poor whites. Because what it is it almost makes it seem like, well, you have white privilege and yet you're still poor. And yet you're still unsuccessful. So what's wrong with you? So I think we make a mistake to just, there are generalities, of course, but we need to focus more on looking at the individual, because when we break it down to something so simplistic as race, oftentimes then we lose the nuance. And, who's more, and you end up with crazy things like, well, we're talking about reparations. So does Obama get reparations, but it's paid by the homeless white guy down the street? You know what I mean? And it ends up with these crazy situations.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I can't. I guess there's multiple things. I can't quite remember anything about what this guy that I'm about to reference said, but what's his name? It's not Don Lemon. It's the guy that replaced Jon Stewart on the Daily Show.
Oh, Trevor Noah.
Trevor Noah. Yeah. He gave like a really good monologue one time about like how it was regarding reparations, but it kind of like shed light on the whole white privilege thing, because like he used kind of an analogy or a metaphor. I don't know what you call it, but basically like there's a whole bunch of poor people in America that keep hearing about like, oh, white privilege, like how do I activate that? Where's my white privilege? And basically his point or something was like, I don't quite remember his point. I just remember that it was good to listen.
Yeah.
So maybe you have some time later. It's like a 2-minute long monologue. I think it kind of helped shape my current view on the white privilege thing. So I don't know. It might be good.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out. I definitely will. Kind of shifting a little. So when we start to lay out the reasons that maybe certain races or certain communities aren't doing as well, one thing I think we were on the edges of this last night.
Sorry, could you repeat that? My internet cut.
Oh yeah, no problem. I said, just to change the subject just slightly, I think one thing that we skirted around last night is, how do you define success, right? Because that could be anything. Like, success could be who has the most wealth, but it also could be, who has the best families or something like that, But I think we're basically on the same page when we're talking about success. So when we're looking at communities that aren't as successful, and we're laying out all these factors. So, like with the black community, something I look at that stuck with me, I think I heard Thomas Sowell, who's a black economist, talk about this. And he talks about how in the 60s, there was a report done by a Democrat. I think it was 62. It was called the Moynihan Report. And what the Moynihan Report did was it went in and investigated people in the black community and child rearing. And it said that 25% of children in the black community were born out of wedlock. And that was a national crisis. That's what the Moynihan Report said in 62. Done by a Democrat, by the way. Now the number is closer to 75%. With white communities, it's over 50%. I think that has a huge impact and is a huge reason for troubles, because we see that having, like, the three big successes that we see that could predict success in life more than anything are, you're born in a 2-parent household, that you were employed, and that you graduated high school. And I think that a lot of these, it's not genetic. That's not what I'm saying. I think a lot of these communities, they're like the black community, so many people born out of wedlock or in single parent families, it's really tough then. It sets the mark culturally. And so I think that that's where we see then, you don't have you don't have 2 parents, you probably have 1 parent that's working, or or whatever the case. But it's hard I think 2 parents are important. By the way, I don't care if it's 2 men, 2 women, whatever. I just think 2 parents are important. So I think that because we see those numbers increase, and the thing is, and not only am I making that argument, but I also say this happened, this explosion, and a lot of these numbers, like employment numbers, people incarcerated, things, wealth, how much wealth in general you have, education levels, a lot of them in the black community have gone down since the civil rights movement. So my looking at it's like, if this had to do with systemic racism or institutional racism, why are certain things worse now than when we were closer to slavery and Jim Crow?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so that's a question that I've heard kind of appropriately dealt with by people like Destiny. I mean, I'm not really a good substitute for that, but one of the things that I kind of got from that, because I'm not too good at like memorizing all the facts and whatnot, is just like, I don't know, one thing that people tend to point to based on my memory is just people talk about how like at some point we started kind of what is it, the war on drugs, that type of thing, where like, you know, things like marijuana, possessing marijuana and stuff like that became like a really kind of big deal crime. Like, you know, you would go to jail, there's mandatory minimum sentencing if you got caught with like hardly any, I don't know what your stance is on marijuana. I don't really care.
Legalize it,
drugs,
yeah.
But like, yeah, I mean, I don't care about it at all. Like either way, really. But like, yeah, basically, I mean, like there was a lot of kind of, the laws were in place to like basically punish people if you wanted to, effectively.
Okay.
And I think that I'm not sure what, you know, what caused what came first, chicken or the egg, but you know, certainly now, you know, a lot of the issues that we see with the stats, with the, you know, black crime and black drug use and convictions and blah, 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 a lot of that I think has to do with the large amount of police presence that is in, you know, black communities.
Right.
But obviously, you know, that had to happen at some point. And I'm not sure if, you know, it happened as a result of the war on drugs. Like, I don't know if people were doing kind of just fine and they said, oh, well, you know, we don't, you know, I don't know if I trust the black person as much as the white person, so I'm going to put some more cops there because we got this new war on drugs. And black people are always using drugs. And then, of course, with the increased police presence, you find more people with drugs because that's what that does. And then you know, end up locking them up, and then the single mothers, and then, you know, that, I think that type of thing might have been kind of a start of one of those cycle events. And I'm not saying it's like a definitive event, like a line in the sand, and we say, oh, after this point, like that's when it happened. But I think it's, you know, there's just a whole, it's like a very complicated system.
Right.
And, you know, I guess I don't necessarily like possess all the know-how to disargue with like the, you know, people stating like, oh, well, things were kind of better for black people, like, you know, 40 years ago or whatever. Right. But I think there's a lot of black people that don't think that things were better 40 years ago. I'm not sure, but I think it's, I don't know.
Yeah.
Basically, like
Well, and it would depend on the metric, you know.
Right.
What do you mean by, like, incarceration levels? Yeah, it was probably better 40 years ago, but treatment by your local, you know, political movement, probably not. So, you know, I get that.
Right.
One thing I could say on that just a little, you often hear one of the big examples given of kind of discrimination in kind of police enforcement is crack cocaine laws. Because cocaine, particularly in the 80s, was something that was more of an affluent drug. But crack was more of the poorer version, and it turned out that many more inner city people used it. And as you know, I don't, like, to me, it was an inner city problem, not a race problem. But there happened to be more black people in the inner city. So a lot of people say, well, the fact that crack became much more punished than cocaine proves that this was racially motivated. But if you look at it, the people that actually pushed for that law, the groups that lobbied for that, actually were black communities. And it was because they saw crack like running rampant through their neighborhoods, and gang wars were getting absolutely incredible. And so they pleaded with law enforcement, like, do something to lock these people up. Now, I think that the law, that doesn't mean that it was applied correctly. But I think that, you know, I think it's just an example of, we look at the you look at the end result and you say, was the motivation for, I'm not saying you're saying this, by the way, but I'm saying, you could look at the end result and say, see, more black people use crack, it's punished more, even though it's basically the same effect as cocaine. This proves that it was racially motivated. But, you know, I kind of disagree. I'll throw this out there. This is something I've said a lot. and we'll see what you think about this. It's kind of on this topic. So one of the things that confuses me, and I having talked to you now, I don't think you fit into this camp. But with like the intersectional camp that wants to focus a lot on kind of the idea of, you know, whether you call it cultural Marxism or victimhood culture, they tend to want to look at us as groups. So I'm not Rob Noor, the individual. I'm a bunch of categories. I'm a man. I'm straight. You know, I'm overweight, all these things. And then you just say, is that oppressor or oppressed? And victimhood's kind of a currency. So anyways, what I'm saying, the only reason I bring this up is a lot of people that supported kind of the idea of Black Lives Matter, and particularly discrimination in law enforcement and the judicial system, also happen to be feminist. That's just the way it shakes down. And so I'm being wordy here, but here's what I want to get to. You often hear these people say, well, look, if you look at the statistics, we could say, and I'm fudging these numbers, I don't have the exact one, it's just an example, but they would say, like, we could prove that the legal system's unfair towards blacks, and here's why. Because blacks are incarcerated 15%, or blacks are 15% more likely to be arrested, 15% more likely to be convicted, get a 15% longer sentence than a white that commits basically the same crime or does the same thing. And I think that we've already talked about, and I think you would agree, that doesn't necessarily prove racism, because you have to, there's a big conversation, right, that you need to have, like, well, wait a minute, we need to unpack this. Racism could be a potential, but it also could be poverty. Maybe it's just blacks happen to be poor. Maybe it's inner city, you know, that it happens to be worse. But would you agree with that there could be a lot of factors?
Yeah, so like early when we were like kind of listing factors, or really just, you know, kind of, yeah, we listed like 4 things.
Yeah.
Like,
there's way more.
Something like, you know, whatever we want to call it. You know, we might need to make up some new words or whatever to describe what they call it versus what we call it or whatever. But the whole systemic like racism type thing, which that might be to those people, or when they say racism, even like I was saying before, that might be the catch-all word for them. Like, right. You know, the fact that they're poor in greater numbers is a result of racism. And therefore, like, them being poor would be what they would call systemic racism. Like, them being poor in greater numbers, you know, we can talk about, you know, whether or not people are still like actually racist to them and like keeping them poor, but the cause of their poverty, you know, the reason that they're more poor than white people today seems to be as a result of like all of the other crap that they went through that was like actually racist.
Yeah, and
I think it might just be a relabeling. I think it might just be like a naming type of thing, like where they're saying like, oh, racism is causing all the problems today. But what they mean by that is actually like, oh, you know, all of the compounding effects of racism from the past.
Yeah, but I think that my disagreement with that would be, I think that certainly could be a contributing factor, but I don't think that it's the most important factor. And I think that we see a danger when we just look at statistics and we say, well, blacks are incarcerated more, so that proves that this is racism, whether it be systemic from the past or current racism from law enforcement. But it's that idea of, it just, whether it be intentional or not, that there is a system that is designed to negatively affect this group because of their race. And I think that there's other factors, like it could be because they happen to be poor. And so, to me, the reasoning matters, because if we say it's because of racism, then the solution is different than if we say, well, wait a minute, maybe it's more of a financial thing, and we need to say, okay, then it's not, you know, race isn't the root of it. The root is, how do we help these races get better financially and things like that. So that's, I guess all I'm saying is, would you agree that we can't, it's not so simplistic as just saying, if the numbers show this group of people on average is more likely to be convicted than this group of people, that doesn't necessarily prove bigotry. It could, but it doesn't prove it. We need to look at all the factors. Would you agree with that?
I mean, so this is one of those, like, it's one of those things. I mean, kind of on a surface level, yes, but it's one of those things where, like, the people that are complaining about racism, I don't think they're actually complaining about, like, you know, current bigotry, like people having ill will towards black people. I think they are kind of saying, like, we need to do something about the fact that, you know, black people were kind of screwed over in the past, and they're still here, you know, they're still screwed today. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that that's kind of more what they're talking about. And so, I think I get
it. I get it.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's not like they're just saying that cop was a racist. They're saying I have a bunch of negative factors in my life, like my economic situation, my education level. It could be simple as a one-parent family. Maybe your health's poor, and it's because of result of racism in the past that led me to this situation. Is that kind of what? Am I summarizing that correctly?
Right. The strongest. I'm starting to remember Trevor Noah's little reparations argument. The strongest argument that I heard is kind of just an economic one. Like the difference between a slave in 1850 and like a white person in 1850 is that like because of Jim Crow and all sorts of stuff, and slavery of course prior to Jim Crow, like a white person, even a poor white person, was like able to like accumulate wealth and make the exponential gains off of that investment. Whereas if you were kind of black, you were more or less restrained significantly. I mean, there's a bunch of successful black people, but like a lot of black people were restrained from kind of investing that wealth and growing that wealth and stuff like that. And so it's not just that like we owe like every black person like $100 because that's how much Civil War dollars they lost or whatever.
Right.
It's kind of like it's a wrong that's like so big from an economic perspective that it would be impossible to actually correct. And that's not saying that like we shouldn't. I mean, I'm not really for reparations, but it's not really saying that we shouldn't do reparations just because it would cost so much money to actually right the wrong that was done. But it's just, I think it's just indicative of how much investment in the black community and stuff like that we would need in order to like make the wrong right again, because these people are not they didn't get to invest money for 150 years or 100 years until like the civil rights law, but even after then still a bunch of stuff going on. Like it's kind of like just like you can put money in a bank and that interest can compound, and after 100 years you can have like $1 million where you just had 10,000 before. If you don't put that money in a bank, you don't get that interest, and so you basically lose $1 million over the course of 100 years.
And I get that, but I would argue that the problem then is you are the person today who is poor or who is doesn't have as many opportunities for education or for healthcare or things like that. That to me is the problem. One of the possible factors could be because my ancestors, because of the color of their skin, weren't afforded the same opportunities. But the problem is, I think there's a lot of negative impact to making racial-based policies. And if we want to solve that problem, why not just say, okay, we will then enact policies to help poor people? Because if you don't, and you just say, well, we're just looking at the racial factor, then what do you say to the poor white guy that's like, but wait, just because I'm white, my ancestors didn't have all this money. They'd say, whether they be unintelligent or they just, were unlucky, or maybe they were ill, they didn't have those opportunities either. So that's just a factor. The problem is the poverty, and all the things that come with it. So that's what I never understood about affirmative action. It's like, just say, if you're below this economic level, we'll give you an advantage. It happens a lot of black people are disproportionately below that level, so they'll get disproportionately that advantage. But the policy then is issued towards who you are, not the immutable characteristics like your skin color or your height or your weight or your gender or your sexuality. All that stuff's irrelevant to me. Your situation in life, that's what it is. You might be in a bad situation and you think it's because of your race, or you're in a bad situation and you think it's because of your health. But we should solve the bad situation instead of saying, we'll just have a fix-all for one of those symptoms or one of those factors.
Right. So I think I kind of agree with that in the sense that like I've read articles before about how they're kind of critical of people that would rather kind of just help black people instead of helping like different groups where blacks are disproportionately represented, and then using that as a way to help black people. So I mean, I can kind of totally get on board with the whole what's it called? Just helping out poor people, and that then helps black people.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry,
please.
And I guess I was just gonna say, like, fortunately, I mean, because there are actually people that like actually are. There's not many, but there are people that are still racist today.
Sure. Yeah.
But really don't want to help out poor people that much today too. And sometimes they're the same people, sometimes they're different people. But I think that a lot of the kind of anti-poor sentiment that kind of goes around might also be one of those lingering effects where, like, when people think of poor people, they might think more of black people than of white people, and so might have reservations against helping out, people who are black or something like that.
That could be. That just real quick to go with kind of the story that's given. So a lot of these people that then say, the numbers should prove that racism. I think that we need to look at all the factors. I don't think that it proves racism in law enforcement. But then what I'll say is, okay, if I concede that argument and I say, if black people are all of these factors, arrested more, incarcerated more, convicted more, have a longer sentence, harsher prison conditions, which is all true, by the way. That is all true. If we just say that must prove racism or systemic racism, did you know there is a group that actually proportionally is far more disadvantaged by law enforcement? And I'll explain
like Native Americans or something.
Well, no. The worst discrepancy, if we're looking at groups, is men to women. Men are incarcerated far longer than women. Men are far more likely to be arrested. Men are far more likely to be convicted. So if it's like the difference between blacks and whites might be 15% longer sentence, the difference between men and women are like 30% longer sentences. So if you say that the numbers alone prove bigotry or prejudice, then why aren't the same people saying Black Lives Matter? Why wouldn't they then be saying, well, men lives matter? Because actually, men are disadvantaged against women even more than blacks against whites. And I think the answer, when I ask people, and again, I'm not saying you're in that camp, but when I ask these people that are intersectional that, what they respond to me is, well, men commit more crimes. And it's like, you don't even realize you're making my point. My point is, we can't just look at those statistics and say, this proves bigotry. We have to look at the underlying factors. It is true that men commit more crime. Like, that's undeniable. That's true. Men have hormones that happen to make them more likely to use physical violence instead of verbal violence and things like that. And so we do have to look at, it would be nonsensical to look at those statistics and say, well, this proves it. Cops and judges are biased against men. And sometimes that might be the case. But I think that that's just my way of showing that it's complicated. You can't just look at the statistics and say, this is all explained away by bigotry, whether it be sexism or racism or some other kind of bigotry.
Right. So there's a couple things there. One of them, okay, I don't know what order to go in, but we'll go in like
go ahead, yeah.
A standard order, I guess. So I think like I don't, and some of the people that I listen to, like Destiny or whatever, I don't really think that there's too much like issue or too much to point at with regards to like black people getting arrested more or something like that. Like, I view a lot of those things as kind of a natural consequence of the fact that they're being policed more, which could be justified because there's more crime, there's more violent crime. And even though all of that entire situation might tie back to sin of people actually being racist to them, like the whole reason they're kind of screwed over is because of this thing. It's kind of like, okay, well, that's what we're dealing with now. We can't just ignore a problem just because it's inconvenient. But on the other hand, there's other kind of statistics that talk about like how, if you put a black person and a white person in front of like the same judge for the same crime, the person gets off easier than the black person most of the time. But
you could say the same of a man and a woman. The woman's going to get off easier.
That's true, and we might, I think people actually do conclude from that. I mean, feminists have a spin on it. I was about to say meninists, but men's rights activists have a spin on it. But basically, I think both sides kind of agree that, like, well, that's probably because there's some sort of sympathy given to a woman that isn't really given to a man, and feminists would say that that's sexism. Even though it benefits them, they would say, that's a benefit we shouldn't really be, receiving or whatever, or that's a benefit that men should be receiving equally to women or something like
but
that.
I just real quick on that, I do kind of disagree with that, because feminist organizations are some of the biggest proponents of stopping legislation that would, for example, make divorce settlements with custody more equal. Right now, women get by far a higher percentage of custody, and feminist organizations are actually out there defending women more, saying no, women are better child rearers. So you would think that a true feminist that believes in equality might be out there going, whoa, 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 we have agency as well. You should, therefore, because we have equal agency as men, we should be punished under the same legal system as men. But I don't see a lot of that from the most vocal feminists. Sorry to interrupt you there.
Right. Yeah. So, I guess with regards to that, like, I think it's a little. It's hard to kind of. I mean, I know that you and I might both agree that, like, the best position to have is a position like right in the middle where you want equality for both genders and you don't want to like pull it one way or the other too much. But I think like there's a lot of like people out there, a lot of guys out there really that are kind of not on board with the whole feminist thing at all, that think things like, oh, well, women should be doing this because they're, I mean, they should be having a bunch of kids because that's what they were like made to do naturally, and they should be doing this. Like, there's so many people out there with kind of negative, from the perspective of the feminists, negative opinions of what women should do, that they're like, okay, we're not gonna like, we're not gonna give up, we're not gonna take men's sides so much that, we lose to these guys that like don't think we should be free at all. I think they're kind of okay, well, we're not going to give ground, because if we give ground, the people that actually just want to put us back in the kitchen or whatever are going to like take way more than we give. I think that's the mentality that they have.
Yeah, and I do think that's something that I think like discussions like this, I think that's why like this type of stuff's really important, because a lot of times it seems like we're put in this situation because, like, I think we have this crazy media and we have places like Twitter where the sensational thing to say and the most extreme thing to say is what comes across the most. And so you'll be so revolted by something that you tend to say, I'm on this other team now. But you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and be like, I'm so on the team of men, or I'm so anti-feminist now that I think that women shouldn't be in the workforce. I do think that that's true, that we need to hedge ourselves and say, wait, there is still a moderate position to be had here. I could be against radical feminism, but at the same time understand that I do want to seriously look and make sure that women have equal opportunity through all things in life.
Right, yeah. And I don't know, I saw that you follow Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
I would follow him, except for whatever reason, I don't even know why, but he actually blocked me.
Really?
I do. Yeah, it was interesting to me too, because he's supposedly like starting a YouTube knockoff or whatever where he's not going to block anybody or something like that. And I was like, well, why would you block me from your Twitter if you're starting this like super free speech thing? Right. It was very interesting. I don't know why he blocked me. I never like just trolled him and was like super insulting, but I have been like pretty critical of him sometimes, because I listen to different critiques of everybody, but him and Saad, I think, have both blocked me. Now Gad I was really critical with, because I don't really like him too much, but
yeah. I follow Gad, but he gets like, if you don't mind, I'll give criticisms of both of them. I like some of what both of them say. I really like Jordan Peterson. Here's my big criticism of Gad, just to start with. Right? Like, Gad, one of the ideas I hate... and this is unfair, but I tend to... People that I respect or that I agree with ideologically, or that are maybe from the same political party as me, I tend to be harsher on when they're doing something I don't like. So I'm all for free speech. In fact, one of my favorite things in the world is comedy. Right? You could make any offensive joke you want. And so the critique from my side of the aisle, right? And I admit I'm biased, I'm conservative, I'm right wing, but the critique from my people would be this. Oh, these left-wing SJWs, they're a bunch of snowflakes, they can't take a joke, they can't meme, right? Okay, that's fine, make that criticism. Then Kathy Griffin makes a joke where she has a fake Donald Trump head, and all these right-wing people are like, censor her, you can't do that, that hurt my feelings. Or, Stephen Colbert says that Trump's mouth is Putin's sea holster, or Samantha Bee calls Ivanka a feckless C word, which I'm not opposed to swearing, but I try to not be too harsh on this channel. But I'm just saying, like, those are jokes. If you don't like it, turn the channel. So I really speak up a lot about that, because I'm like, come on, guys, weren't you on board with me that, hey, comedy's comedy, if you don't like it, change the channel? So in that same vein, right, with Gad Saad, he seems to come from this group that's all like, you shouldn't be calling advertisers, you shouldn't be trying to get people fired, right? If you don't like what they say on Twitter, whatever, just don't. Gad recently has been going out there. He'll say, this person said something I don't like. They threatened me. I found out where they go to school. I've contacted their administrators. Right. And I'm like, dude, what are you doing? Yeah. No, that's antithetical to everything you're supposed to stand for.
Yeah, that was one of the last things I saw from him before I got banned from him. Yeah. I didn't even realize until like a week later. But yeah, I mean, with Gad, it's kind of just like, I get this, like, he's so sarcastic. And it just feels so, I mean, like, I don't use this in any, like, stupid SJW way, but, like, he's so, like, it just, I don't know, just the amount of sarcasm that he levies. And the thing that was really getting me worked up before, I guess he eventually banned me, was, like, he would be, like, so sarcastic that if you didn't already know he was being sarcastic, that he was actually saying what he was saying. Especially, like, it was with Andy Ngo situation. Yeah. Like, he would say stuff like, oh, you know, I don't think Andy's a real journalist. Like, he should probably have gotten beat up. Like, that's my opinion. And then he was being sarcastic, and his fans know that. Well, like, nobody else knows that. And so people would be like, whoa, what the hell are you talking about? And he'd be like, then he would retweet them and be like, oh, this guy is, like, literally the stupidest person in the world because they can't pick up sarcasm.
Right. And you would be
serious.
And you would think that he could, because his entire idea is criticizing people that legitimately have those points of view. So he knows there are people that legitimately believe that. So if you're just a passerby, you're not following Gad, you're like, oh yeah, there's plenty of people that legitimately think Andy Ngo's not a journalist. And so I assume this is another one of those guys. So for him to then use that as like, oh, I'm so above you, you couldn't see, you're so stupid. I agree. I think that's stupid as well.
Yeah, I mean, I just couldn't believe that he, like, because these are people that agree with him.
Right.
And he's basically taking them and raking them through the mud and subjecting them to, like, his 100,000 followers, you know, just because they didn't understand his sarcasm, which is, like, impossible to do on Twitter.
That's right.
If you don't already know. Like, I don't know. It's just, like, I started being, like, really critical of him, like, once I saw that.
Yeah, and I think he's quick to play the victim as well. He criticizes them a victimhood mindset, but when someone says something to him like, you know, you suck, you're an anti-Semite, and he'll be like, you know, my feelings are hurt, you called me that. And
he'll retweet them, he'll do all this stuff.
Oh, you cut out.
He wouldn't do it. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
He'll do all this stuff, like he'll retweet them, he'll comment, he'll be nasty, and it's like, if it didn't actually bother you, if you actually weren't a victim, you wouldn't be acting this way.
That's right.
He acts like a victim, like way too much. Like, and he's the only one in the IDW that really does this, I think.
Yeah. I agree. But, I do like some of what Gad says, though. I do. But I think these are all fair criticism. With Jordan Peterson, like, two I could give off the top of my head. To me, one of the things that in politics jumped the shark here this last year was the Kavanaugh situation, where it was, we literally had, look, let's be honest. There are extremists in every political party, and there are extremists that support every politician you've heard of. I like Ron Paul. There are Ron Paul extremists that said things I was like, whoa, Bernie Sanders, same. Joe Biden, same, you know, Marco Rubio, whatever. You don't really, I don't think it's fair to judge entire groups of people by the extremists. So I don't judge all of the left as Antifa. I don't say all the right's the KKK. I guess that's just what I'm trying to say. But when you start to worry is when the mainstream people that have power in the party say things that are troubling to you. And with the Kavanaugh, I could not believe that during those hearings you had all these people like Kamala and Cory Booker that were literally saying the truth doesn't matter, it's her truth. And you are guilty based on the accusation and must prove yourself innocent. Like, to me, that's antithetical to the entire country. And when I saw, we can talk about whether or not you agree with that, but the reason I bring this up is, you know, Jordan Peterson, who's all against that mindset. What did he tweet when all this went on? Well, Kavanaugh should step down. That's outrageous. Like, that's everything he stands against. I read his book. His whole book's like standing up. Truth must always be defended. Stand up in the face of those that would be untruthful. You know, don't capitulate. Right, yeah. Don't apologize. And there he is saying Kavanaugh should apologize. Regardless of what you think of the Kavanaugh thing, which I would love to get your opinions on. Like, if he would have withdrawn and apologized, that guy looks guilty the rest of his life. His life is over in the public sphere if he says, okay, because of these accusations, I fold. So he had no choice but to go forward as far as I was concerned. So with Peterson, I was like, whoa. And then he mealy-mouthed tried to defend himself by being like, you don't understand. When I'm discussing things, I'm doing it as a professor, and I'm just throwing questions out there. Look, we're all wrong at times. We all have opinions that maybe people disagree with. Own it. Don't mealy-mouth around it and say, oh, I'm just speaking in a different level than you, and you didn't understand. I thought that was weak.
Right. Yeah. With the Kavanaugh thing, I remember when he did that, and he eventually ended up writing some little thing afterwards that kind of retracted or just said it was a thought. I mean, I think that, like, I don't think he was saying, like, I don't know if he said for Kavanaugh to apologize per se, but just to, like, I think what he thought would go down if that sort of action was taken is something like, pictured it would be like Kavanaugh gets confirmed, he gets confirmed despite all these odds, and then he with the whole national spotlight on him, he says, I'm confirmed, and if I accept this job, I'm going to have a life appointment. Nothing you can do to stop me from getting this job at this point. However, because of the way you treated me, I'm not going to accept this job because, I don't think anybody should be. I don't know. I think he basically viewed it as like a moment for Kavanaugh to use the national spotlight that he had to, like, take a stand in a way that's not beneficial to himself per se, but that would be, like, beneficial to the entire like, basically take one for the team, but not in a way that leaves him guilty, but that kind of makes everybody else think. I think that's what he was thinking. I don't think he expressed it very well. He kind of made it seem like, Kavanaugh should just drop out because, it's too hard or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, and that I'll have to go back. You could be absolutely right. I did know he was trying to be nuanced, and I wasn't getting exactly what he was trying to say. But even if that's what he was trying to say, I disagree with it anyways. But the Kavanaugh thing, I mean, to me, the two big stories that just blew my mind, I'm big on the Russia conspiracy thing. I love talking about that, and I think that there was significant abuse by the intel communities. But before people say I'm a bandwagoner, I thought that under Obama, under Bush, under Clinton, like, I don't trust the intel communities. I just don't. Because I think they've lied so many times. But anyway, the Kavanaugh and the Covington Catholic kids, I could not believe either of those stories. Like, where we had a media that just was reporting anything. Like with Kavanaugh, stuff that doesn't even pass, like, oh, now it's this guy was involved in gang rapes, where he gang raped this woman, and then she got gang raped, but instead of going to the cops, she proceeded to come back to 9 more parties. She was the only adult there, watched other girls get gang raped without ever warning them. Like, it's like this, and there were 70, 80 people at these parties, but no one ever came forward with these allegations other than her. It's like, how can the media report this stuff? And it was transparently the media and the Democrats just totally lifting any veil of trying to be fair-minded. It was like, we are going to use every dirty trick we can. We are going to say that the new concept is there is a different set of rules based on your genitals. If you have a certain genitalia, the accusation means you're guilty. And that blew my mind. I still can't get over it.
Yeah, the thing I wanted to mention before, and you just brought something up again that reminded me, is like I think that, like, things going on, and maybe there's multiple things going on, and it's kind of like, from a strategic, like, perspective, the Democrats don't want Kavanaugh to be confirmed, right. And it's not it's not just that, it's like they really don't, because he is. Was it him? I think it's he that was taking the place of the liberal on the court.
So right? It would have switched from liberal. Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So it was like a huge deal to them, and I think I think the reasons that they use to justify I don't think we should take them as, like, what they actually think. I think they're just, like, playing the game, the cards type game that has to be played in order to get things to play. They kind of chose their strategy. They were gonna what's her name? Feinstein, I guess, knew about Christine Blasey Ford from, like, months before.
Yes.
And she was going to bring her out at the right moment if they needed to make a huge statement and all that. And I kind of hate how it's, like, how obvious it was that they kind of used her. I mean, I don't know about you, but, like, when I listened to her testimony, like, I didn't disbelieve it. Like, I think that I didn't see that she was lying. Now, listening to Kavanaugh's testimony, I don't think he's lying either. Like,
Right.
I've just reached the limit of my ability to perceive.
Yeah, and if I'm
So,
objective,
and it's just
when I did videos, I watched all that testimony. I did videos in here YouTube, and my video of Blasey Ford, I said I thought her testimony was pretty good. I didn't come off saying this is a blatant liar. Now I think maybe something happened to her, or maybe I'm trying. I have to be diplomatic. I'm not going to. This is obviously anecdotal, but I know people in life that were convinced they were assaulted at some point, and it's more of a psychological thing, and it turns out that it didn't literally happen. It was more of a result of psychosis and things. But I didn't think she was spiteful, like, I'm totally making up. I didn't get that impression. I just...
Yeah.
Go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, I've never done this thing before.
Oh, no, I'm bad at it. I'm always bad at it. I'm jumping on people's toes, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so so I even tried kind of not to rationalize, like, oh, well, what's the reason? Like, I think it's it's possible that she kind of is misremembering or something. Like, I don't really know, and frankly, I mean, it's also possible that Brett Kavanaugh just drank a lot and he didn't really remember. Like,
yes,
he really does seem like kind of the type of guy to drink a lot. Like,
well, let's be honest, he lied when he was like, oh, I've never blacked out. That's a lie.
Yeah.
That's a lie.
He was obviously not trying to make himself look like the type of guy that could do that.
Right.
But like, it's like, come on.
Yeah.
Like,
but he couldn't say it.
That that's the guy that drank so much.
And that's the shows how despicable this line of attack is. Where literally it's this. Well, can you account for your memories your entire life? Well, no. Aha! So you could have been a rapist. And it's like, wow, that is such a, that is so he has to, you can't argue that game though. So you have to lie. You have to be like, no, I do remember every moment of my life. And it's like, clearly you don't. But, and then the left was like, clearly he's lying. This proves he's a rapist. And for me, I get what you're saying. Strategically, this was a game they had to play. But to me, that's a line too far. For two reasons. One, for the obvious reasons that this is... You never want to use a strategy that could be used against you or your supporters in equal strength. And so, okay, someone came out afterwards, a man, and said, I'm a man, Cory Booker sessually assaulted me in a restroom. Okay, so we have to believe that, right? We have to believe that. But someone said that online. Now, they didn't come forward publicly. They can't, and it's probably garbage. But you know what I mean? Once you say...
Cory Booker gay?
Not publicly. This guy was saying he was secretly gay.
I didn't know that if he was. Yeah.
I think he just recently got engaged. But I mean, so it's like, or Justin Fairfax, Lieutenant Governor, or Al Franken, or Bob Menendez, or Keith Ellison. These are all Democrats. It's like, okay, they've all been accused. So now what? Are you going to, and they're like, well, it's different with us. So it's despicable because it is, the foundation of our country is personal freedom, liberty, and along with that, and the legal aspect goes, you are innocent until proven guilty. The idea was you would rather 100 guilty people go free than one innocent person go to jail. And that's an unfortunate side effect. And that sucks when it's a he said, she said. Right? Because it's like, we say you have the burden to prove that person's guilty. And there have been probably rapists and other disgusting criminals that committed these acts and got away with it because we just couldn't meet that threshold of proof. So when the Democrats that are the most powerful in their party are advocating, no, we can suspend that, the foundation of this country, because we think it's important to win this political argument. That's devastating to me. The other thing, which, depending on how you're looking at this, that's maybe even more impactful is you disgrace every single true survivor of sexual assault by making a game out of it like this. If Christine Blasey Ford really was sexually assaulted, especially if she was really sexually assaulted by Kavanaugh, the fact that Dianne Feinstein sat on that allegations for 2 months, let it go until the end, and then used it as a political game is beyond disgusting. And how can you take people that do that seriously when then they stand up the next day and go, oh, and by the way, the Me Too movement and women's rights. It's like, no. You're clearly a liar. Now, that's not saying much. I'm sure me and you could probably agree that most of these powerful politicians don't believe what they say. But to me, it was a gutful. I couldn't believe it.
Right. Like, I guess, like, the only thing that I didn't like about the Blasey Ford testimony was just the fact that it was strategically placed to do the most harm to Kavanaugh. But I got over that because I was like, okay, well, they're playing a game. They're playing a game. Everything they're doing is playing a game. I mean, frankly, like, since the Republicans were playing a game too, I guess, because, Kavanaugh can say, hey guys, I didn't really rape this girl. And they're like, yeah, sure. Okay, whatever. Like, it doesn't matter to them per se.
That's true.
I mean, like, I think, like, even if he said, like, privately to them, like, okay, well, this might have actually happened, but, do you want me here or not? Like, they could be like, okay, well, we've got to find a way to kind of make it. And so, like, I don't know. There's stuff that people did, but I think that the Democrats did the most visible stuff. Like, they did the scummiest stuff that was really visible.
Right.
There's stuff that, like, Republicans kind of did that was, like, arguably scummy, but it didn't really appear to be that scummy.
Like, yeah, and
they did that. Yeah.
I mean, I think, though, to me, I haven't seen proof of the Republicans doing, to me, what is over the line, which is to basically publicly make the argument you are guilty until proven innocent. Like, to me, that and weaponizing sexual assault allegations.
Oh, right. I wanted to say something about that, actually. Like,
sure.
I've heard kind of multiple arguments, like some for, some against. Like, the initial argument against the whole, like, innocent till proven guilty stuff with this is that, it's technically like Kavanaugh he's not on trial, right? Like, this is more like a job interview. And if you were interviewing a man and a woman burst into your office and said, this guy just sexually harassed me or something, or did it like 20 years ago or something, like, I don't know. I feel like from a job interview perspective, like, then you're like, okay, well, do I really want to hire a guy when this woman just came up and said, this person, and obviously there's a lot more stuff going on here,
right?
Because people could say, like, oh, she's politically motivated, all sorts of stuff, but, like, I don't think that she personally was politically motivated, and I also don't think that, like, I don't think that she's making stuff up just for kicks or whatever.
Right.
Like,
no, I do think she
think, like, maybe it could be justified from that perspective to, like, kind of say, okay, well, how about you guys talk it out and we decide which one we like better or something like that. Like, I feel like that in this case that might be, like, an acceptable thing, even though it's not innocent till proven guilty, because it's like a job interview for, like, a very prestigious, like, lifelong job.
But I think my response to that would be, it's like free speech, right? Yes, the First Amendment only applies to the government censoring your speech, right? So
right.
you can't walk into Krispy Kreme's. You don't have a First Amendment as far as they could be like, hey, we don't want you here, get out. You're ranting and raving about flat Earth or something. See you later.
Right.
That's not a violation. But the spirit, even though it only legally applies to that, I think the spirit of the First Amendment is, as human beings, we have free speech. And so even if it's not a legal question, if we're talking in a moral, should this be done or should it be not, we should allow free speech. It's the same way here. Even though this wasn't a trial, the concept of innocent until proven guilty morally has to be the right thing to do. So it should have been done here. And also, what's the word I'm looking for? Strategically, it has to be the case. Because think of the precedent you set in both aspects if you allow this to come. If this would have derailed Kavanaugh, and we can admit, I will fully admit, even though the Republicans didn't do it, if Kavanaugh would have been derailed, I guarantee the Republicans would have sat down and been like, okay, we need to find a woman for every single person running as a Democrat. Every single one. And as soon as they start to run or they're appointed, we're going to at the 0 hour be like, bam, accusation, step down. Bam, accusation, step down. And who would run for public office in that world? The only people that will run in that world would be people that are bold-faced liars and don't care about their reputation. That would just stand up and lie, and basically the scummiest people. If you're a legitimate person, you're a family man or woman, you don't want your for God's sakes, they were showing pictures of Kavanaugh coaching his girls' basketball team. Like, should this man be allowed around, children like this?
Right.
To me, I honestly could say I actually teared up in his testimony where he was, started crying talking about his kids. Like, I can't imagine. Like, you're just running for office, or, you're nominated to this position, and the next thing you know, your kids are, going to school and everyone's whispering, her dad's a rapist, her dad gang rapes people. To me, that's more, I love this country, and I ran for office, and, it's something that's very important to me, but my family comes first. And if that becomes the precedent, I can't run for office. I don't want to risk my family like that. And then, even almost more disgusting is, at some point people will get fed up. And this is the problem with the Me Too and the idea of just believing accusations. And then what happens once people get fed up? Now they don't believe any women. The pendulum swings the other way. We're legitimate women that are victims of sexual assault. Everyone's like, it's just like that Julia Swetnick that said she was gang raped by Kavanaugh. It's just like, yeah. And so it's like, that's why we can't play games. It's such a serious accusation for both the victims and the person, the alleged criminal. The stakes are so high. To me, your reputation is all your family and your reputation, that's all you leave life with. And if that could be taken away and you have to prove a negative, we're done as a society. The gloves are off. We wouldn't have any kind of governance. So anyway, I know I'm getting wordy with it, kind of ranting, but now my wife's on here. I'm sure she can tell you crappy stuff I did. She's posting on our thing. So,
So if I remember correctly, there were basically like 3 main Kavanaugh accusers. There might have been a few more that were like not main.
Right.
But the first one, Blasey Ford, like she's the one that I found like by far the most credible.
Yes.
Like the other 2, like no. But so like the second one was like, I feel like the story behind her might be something like, she knew Kavanaugh and right now she's liberal and she doesn't like him and she doesn't want him to win.
Right.
And so she's doing this. Like I think that might have been the actual motivation. And then with the third one, that was like the Michael Avenatti one, right?
Yep,
so
that
like,
was the gang.
That's more of like the most malicious type of thing where like, okay, hey, I want to become president. If you will go with me and do this horrible thing, we can like make something work. Like, because he was trying to become president. He was getting all this airtime and stuff. Like he's now we found out he's a really despicable guy. Right. Aside from that, so it's like, Avenatti's going to prison for a long time for stuff that didn't even pertain to what he did with Kavanaugh.
Yep.
And but aside from all that, like I think that the whole Me Too thing, like with people saying like, oh, we should believe women and all that stuff, like we can talk about, like, we can say stuff like, oh, it's innocent until proven guilty, and that's like a really good motto to live by. But I think like from a statistical perspective, like I don't know what stats you believe or don't believe or whatever, because different people have different thoughts. But I think it's kind of like the incidents, the occurrence of a woman falsely accusing a guy, like in a real like legal fashion, like I'm going to the police and we're going to court, like it's something like 2 to 5% or 2 to 10%. It's low basically in comparison to the non-false accusations. And so I feel like when people say stuff like, oh, we should believe women, like I think first of all, they're not talking about like the courts. They're not saying like, okay, courts, you need to start, not dropping this innocent until proven guilty thing. But I think they're more talking to like the public, just to say like, hey, even though like the court system will deal with this and process it, like we don't have to pretend like there's not a huge probability that the woman isn't lying, and each situation can be evaluated independently. Right. Like if it's an Avenatti situation, I mean, that was BS from the start.
Right.
Like you could tell immediately. The second person, I don't know which one, I don't know what her name was, but the second person is like, okay, well, maybe, we'll see if a bunch of people come out and confirm your story, but as of now, I don't know. But the Avenatti person was like, oh yeah, this is definitely like BS from the start. But like I think most people are more like Blasey Ford, where it's like, okay, well, I hear you tell this testimony and I don't really see too much like ulterior motive here, so I don't know why I wouldn't believe you. And I think what they're saying is like, if you ever get into a situation where you don't know who to believe, like your money should probably be on the woman, just because like if no red flags have popped up for you to not believe the woman, then statistically speaking, it's just so much more likely. And unless you're serving on the jury, you should probably not be saying like, oh well, there's no way this guy did it because like women lie or stuff like that.
Right. Well, I don't know about this. I have to plead ignorance. I honestly do, but I do know this: in most of the high-profile public cases that we've seen, they're either not been proven one way or the other, or it's been proven to be a hoax. You could go through Mattress Girl, the VA rape scandal, Swetnick, Ramirez was the second lady's name. Blasey Ford wasn't proven. I mean, it's like almost every major case. That's why it's not when it's being used at a public figure, where the accusation's being accused at a public figure. I think that it's hard to look at that at the general statistics because there's other stuff going on. So, for example, look at it this way. Let's say a woman right now walks into the police station and says, this guy, whatever his name is, raped me. This just happened, The chances are, you look at the nuance of that, but I would guess the percentage of that being a hoax is very low. But someone who didn't say anything for 30 years, who's a donator and a lifelong member of the opposition of some guy's party, then all of a sudden that guy's getting promoted to something and they come out. I'm not saying that proves they're lying, but those people, it seems more often than not, the average statistic doesn't apply. It might even be, I don't know the number. And that's the thing about the 2 to 5% number too. We have no way of knowing. Like, most rape cases go I don't know if unsolved is the right word, but there's not a conviction, right? I think that's true.
Right. Yeah.
So it's hard to definitively say. I think that, in fact, I could be wrong, and you maybe know this better than me, but it's something like a large portion of rape accusations never go to trial in the first place. And then of the ones that go, a pretty decent proportion don't result in convictions. So it's hard to... Now, that doesn't prove that it was a hoax, but it's hard to say. I don't know where these people come up with... regardless if the number's really high, a really high percentage or really low, how do you determine that if there wasn't a criminal conviction?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I don't actually know the answer. I think that people do have kind of a way of determining what the stat should be or is or whatever. Like, I think I don't know exactly how. I'd have to look up. I mean, probably the wiki page would have good enough information. But I don't know. But I think I kind of agree with the whole public figure thing, except I don't know. It's kind of one of those things where if you go looking, you can find a whole bunch of false accusations and stuff, or if you go looking for a different thing, you could find a whole bunch of true allegations. You got Bill Cosby and you got Weinstein.
You're right.
Between the two of them, that's 100 women. That already makes the average ridiculous.
Fair, yeah, that's a fair point. I didn't think. See, I guess I would have erroneously thought that's one guy, but it's actually hundreds of women. Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying. For me, one of the things that's really difficult, and I'll just real quick say, I still think that was unforgivable what the Democrats did there. Not saying that the Republicans wouldn't do it, but I felt they should be punished. And by the way, just a little about me, I'm always, even though I vote Republican, I criticize Republicans all the time, and I'm always country first. I would vote for a Democrat that if I thought they would do a better job. And if I'm voting for Trump in the 2020 election and a Democrat wins, the very first thing I'll say is, I hope they prove me wrong. I hope this country does fantastic. So, by no means am I just a hack that's the other side's always wrong. I'm not saying that at all. So I can understand that the Republicans very easily could strategically weaponize this as well, which is why it's, we should call it all out. It's despicable. But one of the things I was going to say to you, just your opinion on this is, because I have this stance where I try to always be hey, I don't want to judge someone unless I have proof they're guilt. It's really hard when these situations like Weinstein come up. Because on one hand, you're okay, or Bill Cosby's probably even a better example. It's okay, right. I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. He deserves to have his day in court. But on the other hand, the anecdotal evidence is so convincing. It's not that they waited for years. It's most of them said things contemporaneously. They were kind of ignored for years by the media. And so, with that, it was I struggled so hard because I'm I don't want to be one of these people that are out there yep, he's guilty, that's it. But on the other hand, I don't want to be a liar or be naive where it's maybe he didn't do anything.
Right.
So it's so tough to walk that fine line.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I would maybe avoid this just by not holding so true to the whole innocent is proven until proven guilty thing, because it is one of those things where okay, even if you see somebody murder somebody right in front of your face, they did it, and you'll probably be a witness at their trial. But that's different than the innocent until proven guilty. So you can still believe oh yeah, they definitely did it, without sacrificing your innocent until proven guilty thing. Because even if you saw them commit a crime right in front of you, you still couldn't say like, oh, they're guilty like in a legal sense because they haven't had their day in court.
Sure.
But like they still, obviously like in that extreme situation, they've definitely done it. But like I think it's kind of that way with like Bill Cosby. Like I don't have any problem with saying like, oh yeah, Bill Cosby did that, because like I'm not saying like he is, he legally has been convicted. I'm not saying that. I'm saying like I believe he did that. Like 50 women, like they're not. There's no freaking way that that's a lie.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, like, and it is. It's. And I agree with you. Like I do know it's important to look at the things with nuance. We're now seeing with Epstein. I don't know if you saw this where Epstein was arrested.
Right.
You know. Yeah. Okay. Right out of the gate, people's gut instinct was, how can I use this to go after the people I don't like? So if you don't like Trump, you're like, aha, see, he's connected to Epstein. If you don't like the Democrats, you're like, aha, Bill Clinton and all these Hollywood people, and he gave money to Chuck Schumer. And so I did a video earlier today where I was talking about this. Like, you have to look at this with nuance. To me, just having an association with this guy does not prove that you knew that he was committing these acts or that you were involved in those acts.
Yeah.
The more you had an associate, like, so let's say this, like, let's give some different scenarios. You're a socialite, you're hanging out in New York City, you happen to be at a lot of parties that this guy was at. You probably didn't know what he's getting up to. In the back of your head, you might be like, hey, I've heard rumors this guy's kind of into weird sex stuff. But that's probably about it, right? Now, that's different than you're frequently going to his house. That seems... It still doesn't prove that you knew what he was up to, but the chances, right? And would you agree with me? It's like, okay, that's kind of another level of, well, more likely than known something, but to me, that's still not proof. Now, when it gets shady, it's like you flew on his plane for 20 times where there were underage girls that are claiming they were sexual assault victims. Now, it's starting to look really shady. And then even worse than that was in 2009, he pleads guilty to, there were certainly believable accusations he was guilty of far more than he pled to, but I think he pled to guilt of paying underage girls and having sex with them, and he was sentenced to 13 months and then probation. There were, 2 weeks after that, Katie Couric, Woody Allen, Prince Andrew, they're at his house 2 weeks after that. Now, does that mean that they were raping children? No, I'm not saying that, but come on, you have to answer for yourself if it's like, this guy pleads guilty to having sex with underage girls, basically forcing them, and you're like, hey, he's out, let's have a big party. Like, and so the problem is everybody just wants to be like, everyone who had any association is equally, unscrupulous. I don't think that's the case. I think we need to look at it more nuanced.
Right. I definitely think, obviously anything that comes out that could possibly be used to hurt Trump, they're going to use it. The people that don't like Trump are going to use the stuff that they have to hurt Trump in whatever way possible. And I don't know. I think sometimes it's best just to like mentally or something, the stuff that we kind of expect people to do because they're playing some sort of game or whatever, the whole like I want my side to win game. Like I think we should do our best just to separate that from like our analysis of like kind of what's going on. Like, the fact that all these people are doing it, to get at Trump doesn't like mean that they're trying to like cover up their buddies per se or anything,
right?
Or any sort of like Pizzagate type stuff, or whatever. Like it's just
Well, and it's not just Trump, right? Because it goes the other way. Like I was reading, this is in several news outlets I read that said Chuck Schumer, received donations for 7 years from Epstein. But it was like from 94 to 2001. That was before he was ever accused. So it's like, that hardly seems... If you just read that headline, it's like, oh my God, this convicted child sex offender is donating money to Chuck Schumer and Schumer's taking money. That's really bad. But then when you look at the details, it's like, oh, you might not... I'm not a Chuck Schumer fan at all. I would like to see him lose his... And I also think that a lot of the money in politics, it's a nuanced conversation, but certainly I would like to see a lot of that weeded out. So you don't necessarily say, oh, it's a great thing he took this money. But let's be honest. If a billionaire walks up to you as a politician and is like, hey, here's some money, you're going to be like, okay. I don't think that means that Chuck Schumer's endorsing, child sex offenders or he knew what was going on. And I just, I'm trying to call out my own side as well. Be like, now, come on. These headlines are unfair. I just hate that because so many people just read headlines And I try my best. I certainly want my political side to win and want my political ideas to come to the forefront. But I would hope, and I know that it won't be the case, people will use this, for gamesmanship to go after people they don't like. You would hope that, raping children would be something we could say, I don't care if they have an R or a D next to their name. If they're guilty, they deserve the most strenuous punishment possible,
Right. Yeah, I mean, I like I was saying, like, it's just, I don't like how people tend to take advantage of all these situations to do stuff, and there's probably a lot to be said just about, what media does in general and stuff like that. I mean, I don't know if you've been keeping up with like the most recent sort of stuff going around on YouTube. Like, do you watch Tim Pool at all?
Oh yeah, he's one of my favorites. Yep.
Right. Yeah. So he's obviously been like, I guess exposing or whatever the whole YouTube thing where they're promoting, what do they call it, like traditional media sources or something like that over like independent creators. But I think it's more like, I mean, I don't know. I could be like very wrong on this. Like this might be a complete bias because I like YouTube so much, but I think that as a whole, like you can maybe not as a whole, but like maybe the best like most unbiased independent creators are probably going to be a lot less biased than like any of the major news sources in a certain sense, because like they're independent, as long as that, like if they're just getting a bunch of money from Patreon or something like that, then they're not beholden to like all of this huge stuff. Like I read something about how like the New York Times was gonna sue Google or something like that because Google was making a bunch of money off of people reading New York Times articles, and I'm like, oh, so that means like the New York Times has like a financial interest in like fucking Google, basically. Yep. Oh, sorry, I didn't.
Oh no, you can swear. It's no problem at all. No problem.
Oh, okay. They have a financial interest in like Google, kind of bending the knee to them, and I'm like, well, that's not right. Like you shouldn't have a journalist outlet that is so big or so like powerful or something that it has the ability such a huge way by Google. Like, I'm sure if Google came up to Tim Pool and said, hey Tim, we're going to give you like $100,000 to shut up about the situation. Like, I don't think he would actually do that at all. Like, even if they offered him $1 million, because like he's it's just a different mindset. He's like one guy instead of like a massive corporation designed to make money and stuff. Like, I think that like a necessary transition, if traditional news wants to save itself, should be like a transition to a non-profit model or something like that. Where like they can't make money. They have to pay their staff and all that junk. Like I think that would just take out all of I'm not saying there are necessarily incentives at play here, but like if there are, there really shouldn't be, because news should be kind of free of financial motivation of the journalists.
Right. And I really like Tim Pool. Did you see he got invited to the White House today to actually on the conference on independent creators? Which is pretty cool. Tim Pool was at the White House today.
Yeah, I saw that. That was pretty cool. Yeah. A lot of people were criticizing it just because I don't know, because Trump did the inviting. I think he basically only invited people that wouldn't be critical of him or something like that. And I don't know.
But he's wrong about Tim Pool, because Tim Pool would. He's one that would.
Yeah, Tim Pool. I don't know how to feel about him, because like I don't know, Tim. Like I saw like Tim Pool and David Pakman, and they kind of did stuff, and then like people like David Pakman and Destiny. Like I don't know. I've been listening to these guys a lot recently, so I'm probably slightly skewed in their direction on this. But like they kind of like seem to trash talk Tim Pool a lot. Like they're kind of like, oh, this guy, like he's kind of they give this feeling of like, oh, he's not doing something right or something like that. I don't know. I haven't like spent time to look into anything. But like, I don't know. Tim Pool gives off this vibe for me. Like I see him criticize Donald Trump sometimes, I guess, but it just seems like when you go over like his videos, like if you watch them or if you just look at the headlines or something, like you'll see all this like critique of the left, and you won't see much like. You won't see any video titles saying stuff like, oh, Mitch McConnell, like, totally screwed up here, blah, blah, blah. You'll see stuff like, oh, AOC's a mess, look at what she did, or like, oh, the left is like eating itself or something like that.
Right.
It'll be all these provocative titles that invoke
and
this
then,
like animus towards the left, but like there's no like balance, I guess.
Yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. I think he has a lot of similarities with Dave Rubin. I don't know if you follow Dave Rubin.
Yeah, I kind of watch him a lot.
Yeah,
I've seen a lot of criticisms of him too.
Yeah, I think that both of them are someone that would have 5-10 years ago said, hey, I'm left wing, I'm basically a Democrat or something similar to a Democrat, but definitely left wing. And now they're more critical of the left than the right. I think both Tim and Dave fall into that category. So I guess there's a couple things to say. One, it's no matter what, if you get into this game, you're always going to have a slant. It's just the way it is. Right. Dave Pacman also has a slant where he tends to be more critical of the right.
For sure.
So I mean, it's really tough to be straight down the middle. The second thing is, one of the things I tell people, they'll be like, well, I am a Republican, so most of my content, if it's being critical of something, is being critical of the left. Though, having said that, I criticize what I call the establishment right all the time. Like this, the warmongers that want regime changes, the neocons, things like that. I criticize that a lot. The people that wanted to bail out banks from the right. I feel like at the top echelons of the Republican and Democratic Party, they're basically one big team. And that team's concerned about maintaining power. And so, Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush might act like they're bitter enemies, but at the end of the day, they're like, we're basically two sides of the same coin. It's kind of a conspiracy, but that's how I feel. So I criticize the Republicans in that sense too. But certainly I'm more critical of the left. But what I tell people is, when I go to my bar here in town, and almost everyone's a Trump supporter, if you heard me at that bar, you know what you'd say? Oh, this guy's a left-wing guy. Because everyone's like, Trump's the man, Trump's the man. And I'm like contrarian. I'm like, well, no, what about this? No, I voted for Trump, and I support Trump. But to me, there seems to be value in offering a perspective that is against the dominant perspective. And so I think if you're someone that's getting into media, like Tim Pohl is I don't know what the word, like new media or low-tech media or something like that. He's not Sticks. This guy follows Sticks Hexenamer. He calls it legacy media. The mainstream media is the legacy media, and we're kind of the new media. So your feeling is when you see that the mainstream media is 90% anti-Trump coverage and 90% endorsing what I call the establishment Democrat party or the establishment left, then you're like, well, I need to offer a counter perspective. It doesn't do you any good to like, hey, I'm going to cover the same story that Don Lemon covered in the kind of a similar tone. And that in conjunction with, I do believe that the left is, regardless if you think the shift is good or bad, the left is shifting faster than the right. In that, the party of Barack Obama in 2008 is almost it's indiscernible from the Democratic Party of today. Barack Obama ran on, there's quotes of him saying like, we can't be providing incentive for illegal immigrants. We got to deport people. We got to have these detentions. He's talking how millionaires and billionaires are important. He bailed out the banks, for God's sake. It's not all good, but I'm just saying, and that party, so it's shifted way further. And the irony about Trump, this is something I tell my friends on the left all the time. I think Trump's just 90% ego, right? He doesn't seem to be ideological. So if the Democrats would have just been like, hey, here's George Clooney, Trump. He wants to hang out with you. By the way, you should vote, make sure you're defending Roe v. Wade. It's almost like Trump would have been like, sure, I just want to be popular. Whatever, I don't care, And so it's like, instead of treating him like, the devil, if they would have just been like, hey, you seem like a cool guy, and stroked his ego a little, I think he would have probably went there. Hey, good night, John. I think they would have probably went more to his side. But yeah, I think that's a lot of what's going on with Tim Pohl. And then he gets frustrated, and I feel like Dave Rubin as well. I do think you can make a fair criticism. It's like, hey, most of your content, you say you're one thing, but most of your content leans the other way. But I think that one of the things that frustrates them is it's automatically all of these people are like, well, he's alt-right or he's far-right. And they say this over and over. And it's almost like there is a mainstream narrative that anyone who doesn't agree with kind of what the mainstream media is saying must be far-right. And there's a lot of people that aren't. Someone that maybe you would check out that you would like is, have you ever heard Jimmy Dore?
Does he work for the Daily Wire?
Jimmy Dore used to be on the Young Turks, but he's no longer with them. He's a comedian. I think he's fantastic. He is as progressive as it gets. So he's constantly having on his show people like Aaron Mattei and Glenn Greenwald. These are Trump-hating, legit progressives, like socialists. You know, they get censored by YouTube and others as well because they're coming at the establishment left from the more left position, and that's not acceptable as well. And so, even though I disagree with a lot of them, I can commiserate with them where it's like, okay, I get that you have a voice that they're trying to silence too, and there's something that's worth that because it's a different voice. And one of the things that Jimmy Dore hates Trump. Like he's, by the way, Jimmy Dore is hilarious, and to me, comedy like glosses over everything. If you're funny, it's like, I'll listen to someone that hates me. If they're funny, it's like, it's great. So I think Jimmy Dore, he's a comedian first, and he's absolutely brilliant. He's been on Joe Rogan, by the way, but it's Dore, Jimmy Dore. You should check him out. Okay. I really. But anyways, I'll end this rant here. One of the things about him that I think's amazing is he hated Trump, but he was against the Russia collusion narrative because he's like, look, these are the same Democrat warmongers that wanted regime change in Libya, and they're just creating another boogeyman that's going to lead us into another conflict. This is garbage. There's plenty of good reasons to hate Trump. Stop pushing this conspiracy theory. People said, aha, you helped get Trump elected. And this poor guy's like, are you kidding me? I spoke out against Trump more than anyone. But because he disagreed with the Hillary Clinton style of politics, all of a sudden he's the bad guy on the left. And that to me, I think is where someone like Tim Pool gets frustrated, where it's like, dude, I didn't even vote for Trump. I'm voting for Andrew Yang, and yet I'm considered far right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. With regards to the whole, sorry, I don't know. Whenever I watch things, I think I should maybe be more assertive or something, just because.
I'm the same.
What?
I'm the same way. You get into a cult of personality. It's like, hey, Dave Rubin's the man. I'll just agree with Dave Rubin. And sometimes you should be more assertive. Just because you agree with someone most of the time, you shouldn't just leave it passively hit your ears.
Sorry, I was just meaning like in the call, like just yeah, just so that I can. I don't know. I'm very like passive, I guess, so I don't like.
Well, and I'm the opposite. I'm the opposite. So I'm sorry.
Right. So I don't know, because I think there's like so much that I would want to talk about, but sometimes you like go through like 50 different things.
I'll try to. Yeah.
I have to try and like remember which is the most important one that I want to get. So like one that I kind of might want to talk about, I guess, is like this whole like when it's kind of another like labeling thing, because like my mom is kind of the same way in the sense that like she'll label people as like alt-right. Like she's pretty liberal. She'll label people as alt-right, and I look them up and I watch some of their stuff. I'm like, oh no, this person is like not alt-right at all. And then like I'll come back and I'll be like, hey, this person's not alt-right at all. Like what the heck? And she'll be like, oh well, they have a bunch of alt-right people, like they support alt-right type of stuff. And I feel like that's one of those points that like a lot of people maybe don't think about or something like that, is like people like Dave Rubin, I think is like the I don't know, best example of this. And I think this is why he's getting kind of made fun of a lot by the Sam Cedar guy, right? I mean, have you heard of him?
Yes.
He's really like recently, I think he's been getting made fun of a lot just by this one particular group of people or whatever.
Debate Sam Cedar. The Twitter comments always say that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And basically I think the main criticism that they have of Dave Rubin is that like, effectively on. Can you hear me?
Oh, you cut out there for a second. I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the main issues I think with Dave Rubin is just he gets these people on, and it's kind of like why, like people like, I don't know how you feel about Stefan Molyneux, but like people like him, people like, people that are worse than him, that are kind of like more the type of people that Destiny debates, because like Destiny is kind of known for debating people that are like actually alt-right or very, very friendly with like, so friendly that they like defend the alt-right or something like that. And those people that Destiny debates, and in my opinion like very thoroughly, like undisputably trashes, like some of those people, some of the more mild ones, end up getting onto Dave Rubin's show, and then they talk about, I think like Blair White might be like the best example of this, where she's like, oh, I'm a trans woman, and so I'm kind of speaking for my group, and yeah, wish I wasn't trans, and blah blah blah, and all this other kind of stuff, and all this, all these experiences that she kind of shares that kind of run counter to the type of narrative that a lot of trans people would want other people to believe, I guess. And it's not that it runs counter to the narrative in like a way that's false, I guess. It's that it just it makes it seem like, oh well, she kind of, like Blair White and other people, I guess too, kind of act like sort of tokens that allow other people that have no idea what's going on to say like, oh well, I know a trans person and she says like it's okay to kind of misgender people if you don't believe in that, so I'm just going to go with that. And I feel like Dave Rubin kind of unwittingly gives a platform to people that then gives all of his audience like kind of an excuse to act in like a not so proper way, or to think like things that aren't quite as mainstream as they would have us think.
It's human nature when you're talking to someone, and this is good most of the time, right? Twitter brings out the worst in us, where it's like, bam, 100 characters, say the most sensational thing, and it ends up with all these kind of crazy arguments. When you're sitting down face to face with someone, it's the opposite. You tend to be more generous, or you tend to be, a lot of people try to avoid confrontation, so it might be like, I think we've disagreed on things here in a civil way, but at least we're not changing what we believe, right? And if one of us says something the other doesn't agree, we'll say, well, no, this is what I think on that, which is good. Right. So I think we're doing a good job. But I think that you're right, that Dave will fall into the process of, it's like, you basically give milquetoast, like, no pushback. And so someone comes on and they say something, and it's like, now wait a minute, if you really are a classic liberal, what they just said is against that ideology, so why don't you speak up and say, well, you don't have to be a jerk. And I am against these people that say, well, you shouldn't interview someone from the alt-right, or you shouldn't interview a white nationalist. I would interview a white nationalist, right? I don't mind that. But you shouldn't just allow them to say what they're saying without pushback. You should debate them and get your opinion. So I do agree with you. I think that that's true of Dave Rubin. Interestingly, though, if you don't mind, like Stefan Molyneux, I'd like to talk about him for a second. Okay. There are things I like about Stefan. Like, for example, I think that he is very good on the question of never spank your children. Like, that's one of his big things. And I think he's right. I think that we have this kind of, some people have this kind of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but like, old-fashioned mentality of like, get your belt, whoop the kid. And I think the evidence is pretty good that that's actually counterproductive in almost all cases. So that's something Stefan focuses on that I agree with. I think some of the stuff he talks about that's anti-SJW, I agree with. My favorite Stefan thing, it basically has nothing to do with him. He has a guy on there called Dr. Duke Pesta, and they talk about like Shakespeare, but it's not political at all. And I just like it because I think this Dr. Duke guy, it's like, oh man, like I've seen King Lear. It's very interesting to see him talk about, well, here's my feelings on what King Lear meant. So that's my favorite thing that will happen on Stefan Molyneux's show. Things I dislike about him is I think he's way too heavy on this race realism stuff.
And
like, I don't think talking... It is one of the most difficult... And you watch, like, the intellectual dark web people squirm. Eric Weinstein was just on Joe Rogan. It's like walking on eggshells. Rogan's like, you think there's anything to this IQ stuff? And Weinstein's like, like...
Well, and go ahead. Like, for me, like, I've never even watched Stefan Molyneux because I've been told by, like, a lot of different people, like, people like David Pac-Man Destiny, even people in the IDW, that he's kind of, like, not really... like... I don't know. Like, I think me watching him would kind of, and it's funny because when you say like, oh, I like Stefan Molyneux because of his position on like spanking kids and that other thing you said, to me that's kind of like saying like, oh, I really like Andrew Yang because of his position on circumcision, but I kind of hate his UBI stuff. Like it's kind of like that sort of like his main thing is UBI. A minor side effect is the circumcision, and it would be like saying that you like him for the circumcision but not the UBI, but you still, I don't know, it just seems like for me race realism is like such a huge deal breaker, and I don't know, I've just heard a lot of it's not so much that I can explain why it's not a quote deal breaker for me, even though I disagree with it. Right. And I will say,
this is just my opinion. I don't think that's his big thing. I think he does talk about it, and I think he interjects it when it has no place being involved. But I think that that's something that some people find so unpalatable that they say, this is what this guy's all about. And I would say the vast majority of his videos have nothing to do with that. That's not essential. Like, to me, I don't know that that's central to, the main point he's making most of the time. Though it could be. It's not like I've watched thousands of this guy's videos. I literally watched the ones I liked on Shakespeare because I liked the guy he was talking to, and it had nothing to do with race realism. But that was just entertainment. It would be like saying, well, Scientology sucks, but I still watch Tom Cruise movies. It's like, whatever.
Yeah.
But so I wasn't watching it because I thought I was growing intellectually, like politically or something like that. Now, the race realism, I already said, I feel that, like, you should be able to talk about any statistical stuff. We shouldn't shy away from it for fear of being called racist. Because the consequence of that is we censor ourselves and we're unable to solve legitimate problems that come up. Or, you could end up with terrible situations like we had in the UK where, we had these grooming gangs going on for 3 decades, and everyone was afraid to speak up. The police just let it go because it's like, well, we don't want to be called a racist. And so, like, you have to be willing to say, hey, we can talk about statistics. The problem is, the irony to me is the race realist will be making a lot of the arguments that I made earlier, such as, like, well, you can't just look at crime stats and say this proves racism. Like, a race realist would say that most of the time, right? That doesn't prove that the legal system's racist. Yet then they make the same type of argument when they say, aha! See, if there's an IQ discrepancy in general, that proves some kind of inferior genetics. No, that's an incredible leap. That is the same leap that you're criticizing, right, when you make these arguments about, the institutions not being racist. Because we could say, maybe that is the case on average, but there's tons of things to say about that. One, why is that? Because, like, one of the facts I've never heard race realists be able to get over, they'll say, well, on average, black people's IQ is lower than white people's IQ. Yes, but when we look at the same people with the same ancestors that end up in different countries, that have different situations where they have access to different programs and stuff, their IQ goes up to basically match that of the general population. So is it a genetic thing or is it a social thing? You know what I mean? We have no idea how much genetics... how much social kind of your health or your education level and things like that, how much does that apply to your IQ? How much generationally, right? If you're in poor health for 4 generations in a row because you're in poverty, how does that affect your IQ? Is it just because genetically you're black? There's so many questions about it, and these people just jump to conclusions. And the other problem is, how do they use those stats? And if they start using them, because the same people that make these arguments are like your Richard Spencers that go, aha, see, this proves we want a white country. No. Absolutely ridiculous. No matter what, you treat people as individuals. And again, you remember we were talking about where we say, oh, the system should help, because people are in poverty. And I said, well, race is a factor into that. So let's take this absurd Richard Spencer white supremacist might not be the word, though technically probably is. White nationalist, right? He says we want a white country because blah, blah, blah. And then you start talking about IQ. Why wouldn't you say we want a country of people of a certain high IQ? What does the race... If you're going to mix race and IQ, at the end of the day, you're saying what's really important is the IQ, right? So when you say, hey, we want a country where everyone has higher than 120 IQ, but they out themselves by saying, well, no, the IQ doesn't matter, it's the race. Exactly. Because you're a racist. Right. That's why. So this race realism stuff, it falls through the cracks. So I don't mind someone citing the statistics. We shouldn't be afraid to cite them, but they're irrelevant to me. How does citing that statistic help anything? It doesn't.
Right. Yeah, so the thing about this whole race realism stuff is that it's more than just saying that, like, oh, black people are inferior to white people. It's actually a lot deeper than that. And the unfortunate thing with what I'm about to say is it kind of implicates like about half of the IDW, and another half of the IDW it doesn't implicate, because people like the Weinsteins aren't like. Anyway, I'll just say the type of definition that you'll kind of find on like a encyclopedia, Wikipedia type thing is that like race realism means that there is like a way to biologically define races, basically. So like there is like a genetic, there's a way to like look at somebody's genes and say, oh, this is a black person, like a not just black meaning like they'll have black skin, but like black meaning like, oh, they are of this, they fit into this specific category.
Sure. Yep.
It's kind of like it's a broader statement just about like what that it's possible to even categorize people in a meaningful scientific way on the basis of their race at all. So like when people cite stuff, when people talk about like, oh well, blacks have this IQ and these people have this IQ, it's like, well, why are we talking about the IQ? Like, why is the black group even being given an IQ like average number or whatever? Like, it doesn't make sense from like a scientific perspective, because it doesn't even make sense to have the black category scientifically. Like, the only reason we talk about black people is because that's how we like socially like assign people. Because we said, oh well, over history we said, these people are from Africa, they're black, we'll call them black people, and these people are from India, they have kind of black skin too, but we'll just call them brown people. And like it's kind of like, it wasn't, assignment of races wasn't done in a scientific manner. And so people that kind of people that are race realists are kind of people that purport that the original like intuition of what the groupings of races is like scientifically useful or something like that. And to some extent it is, because the groupings of races, like, I mean, obviously there's like something there, but like from like a lot of perspectives, it's very arbitrary. Like I don't know, you said you like David Pacman, so like
So I just started watching him like a week ago, so I don't want to pretend that I know all of it.
Okay. But he has like two really, really good videos about race realism that like kind of, because I think from the perspective of people like him and what I might consider to be a bunch of experts, I think like the whole race realism subject is kind of like settled, like from a lot of people's perspectives. And then there's a bunch of people that like like people like Christina Hoff Sommers, like I don't think she actually knows too much about the subject. I don't know, but anyway, David Pacman has a really good video where he basically like you might personally know like that black people average have like a higher chance to have sickle cell anemia, right?
Yes.
David Pacman uses this example in his video to illustrate kind of how that's a misleading statistic, because it's not actually that like black people as a whole, like if you take a random black person, and you look at their genes, like you'll have a certain chance, where it's kind of like the reason that we say black people have a higher chance to get sickle cell is because of in certain regions of Africa, certain specific regions, like over the course. Sorry, did you catch that?
Yeah. Can you finish the last sentence? I'm sorry, it cut out a little.
Okay, yeah. So like, yeah, I guess in certain very specific regions of Africa, over the course of the last, however many years, like thousands of years or something, there's been a lot of malaria. And in those specific regions, the population gradually over time developed kind of a gene to resist malaria, but that gene also made them more susceptible to sickle cell. And so it's not that like all Africans have like this heightened chance, or all black people have a higher chance of sickle cell. It's just the ones that are descended from the ones that are from those specific regions. And like the regions aren't even that big at all. They're like, the size of a few African countries today. So while it's like technically correct to say like, oh, people that we consider to be black are at a higher risk of sickle cell, it's kind of more like, well, some of them are definitely at a much higher risk because they've got the gene.
Right.
Others are like no higher than any other white person because they weren't even from that area. And another thing that he does, this is just going to be very brief, is that he like shows two pictures, and they both look like black people basically, and he says, okay, where did these people, where are their ancestors from? And like they both to me look like African people.
Right.
And he's like, okay, well, one of them is from Australia, they're an Aboriginal, and another one is from India, and his ancestors have been in India forever, but he looks like a guy from Africa. And he's like, so, if there's any like truth to this whole like genetic variation, blah, 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 then it would be that it would be, we would be saying like, oh well, these people that look the same must also have like very similar genomes, but because they're so spread out, like the argument doesn't really hold. Basically, it's a really good video that I'd recommend checking
I
out.
will.
If you just search like, yeah, it's really good. It does a much better job of explaining it than I did, and it kind of opened my eyes because up until I watched that video, online defending the bell jar and all sorts of stuff, and I was pretty weeks ago. Sorry, I think I just lagged.
Cut out a little. Yeah, yeah. You're good there. I can hear you now.
Yeah, yeah, but like up until I watched his videos, I was like online defending the bell jar, like calling people out for what I saw as like them being like idiots for ignoring this and that stat. But it's kind of like the scientists, like people. A lot of people think that like scientists are responsible for answering questions, but they don't put much thought into questions that are being asked. Like, why are we asking about an IQ in the first place? Like, why is that even a thing that somebody thought to ask? I remember, like, if you don't mind me continuing to
No,
talk.
please, please.
Yeah, I was watching. So I don't know if you saw the Sam Harris podcast with Charles Murray.
No, I've heard about it, but I haven't watched it.
So in the podcast, which he got criticized really hard for, because a lot of people like aren't really cool with Charles Murray because he's kind of a major kind of race realist type of guy. But in the podcast, Sam Harris, like, the way I described this to somebody who was trying to convince out of race realism was like, basically Sam Harris kind of sucked his dick for an hour and said like what a great guy he was and how much he agreed with him and how much he really liked his work, et cetera, et cetera. So like Charles Murray, all the impression that he was like being very like generous to him and like very fair and everything. And then for whatever reason Sam decided to ask him, why did you study race and IQ in the first place? And Charles Murray like gave kind of like what anybody would consider to be kind of a weasel answer. Like he just kind of like squirmed out of answering the question, and he ended up not answering it. And I was listening to this and I was like, wait, what? Like, how could he not answer that? Like that's a good question. Like why are you investigating this? And Sam Harris like seemed to notice, and so like 5 minutes later he pivoted back to that same area and he's like, okay, no, really, why did you study this in the first place? And he just wouldn't answer. And I'm like, well, why aren't you answering like this most basic, like fundamental science question? Like every scientist should be able to answer the question, like, why did you choose this question to look at? But it just seemed like he was unwilling to like, and to me that just makes me feel like there's some disingenuous type of stuff going on.
That could be. I haven't watched that. I would be interested.
Right.
So
yeah, definitely check out. I'm giving you like so many videos to check out. Feel free to give me some stuff to check out.
Yeah. I definitely want to check out Destiny, and I want to check out that. I think that would definitely. So there's a lot to unpack that I would say. So the first thing I would say is I think a lot of the criticism you levied at race realist, I could also levy at like people that want to talk about systemic racism and the plight of blacks. Like they also, I think, overgeneralize, because I think that's one of the big criticisms you're making is we just say black, but what does black mean? It could be black from Africa. Like, for example, one of the groups that actually statistically are having a lot of success in the measures we were talking about earlier are Nigerians. They end up doing incredibly well. They outperform whites in the United States. But we would consider them black. If I saw them, I would consider them black. So we tend to overgeneralize. But I think that's the case not just with the race realists, but also with the people talking systemic racism, because they'll just say blacks are disenfranchised. But what does that mean? Well, it's because of systemic, and then we see someone will say, like, I saw someone said this about Kamala Harris, like, well, wait a minute. You're not like, you're talking about like the systemic racism that impacted you, but at the same time, like, your parents were from Jamaica. They were never slaves. Your ancestors was never slaves, and they actually owned slaves. I've heard. I don't know if that's true, so I shouldn't repeat.
Well,
okay.
That's the thing. Like with Kamala and Barack Obama's ancestors. Well, Barack Obama is different. His white mom owned slaves. But if you're black and your ancestors owned slaves, then the reason that might be is actually because like the slave master 150 years years ago kind of like had sex with your great 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 whatever and produced you. Like it might not be as damning as it looks. Like be that their ancestor was a product of rape from a slave owner, which did happen quite frequently. I mean, that's why we have
Sure.
a lot of kind of lighter skinned African
But that's
Americans.
still your
Yeah,
ancestor. I mean,
right. Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's why this kind of ancestral guilt is nonsense. Like that's one of the reasons I don't even like to touch it. But and you could ask someone, okay, well, give it. I think that maybe you would agree with me that sometimes it's overgeneralized when we're talking about systemic racism, because you could just look and say, oh, that person's black, they must have been a victim of systemic racism. No, actually, I'm a doctor that came from Nigeria. I'm a
right.
first generation
Yeah,
immigrant.
yeah. I think if you do the first type of thing where you say like, oh, you're black, you must have faced so much oppression. I think that is wrong, but I don't think it's wrong to say stuff like, and everything that is said in a simple way usually carries like a stronger connotation underneath it. And so when people say stuff like, blacks are experiencing systemic discrimination in America, they don't really mean all blacks. Like there's like Ben Carson, he is like the golden boy who was in the ghetto, single mom, and now he's like a super well renowned, surgeon or whatever the heck.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like the super awesome counterexample that everybody would point to say like, this isn't really happening. But like, and this actually ties into the Asian thing that we never got around to, but
Mm-hmm.
like Nigeria, the reason Nigerians are doing so well in America is because like it's kind of like and Asians too, like it's really kind of the same reasons. Like honestly, they should be doing just about the same in my opinion. I don't know if they are or not. I
Right.
don't know what the
It's
reasons
close.
are,
It's
but like
close. Yeah.
yeah, but like the reason they're doing well is because of kind of a selection bias in terms of who's coming to America. Like in order to immigrate from Asia or Nigeria to America, you have to be able to afford to like make the transoceanic flight with your family. It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of whatever. And so the fact that it takes money, like tons of money
Mm-hmm.
to move that far rather than just like walk across the border or whatever, means that you've got to be pretty well off in Nigeria or China or whatever in order to even come here in the first place. And people that are well off tend to be more educated and all, more wealthy, etc. And so I feel like that kind of,
But the problem with
well,
that is that
yeah,
I haven't seen it proven that there are a ton of Asians that aren't first generation immigrants that are still doing incredibly well, whose ancestors suffered through all of the laws in California that said that they weren't allowed to have employment. And so there's actually, I mean, I watched this great documentary on this where this is where a lot of Chinese people then, or Asian people, they came together and they started doing things like laundromats and restaurants. And they worked as a collective that then went town to town and said, okay, you just got off the boat. The government's going to discriminate against you. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to send you to, this, what would now be a suburb of San Francisco. You're going to start a restaurant there, and then you're going to bust your butt, and then 5 generations from now, you're going to be incredibly wealthy. So that
right.
doesn't apply for that selection bias. But go ahead. I wanted to get back to the race realism, but go ahead if you want.
Oh, okay. Like it's like we can assume just for now that like there's no difference between the way that like just assume, I know this isn't true, but like just assume that the Asian people that came here a long time ago and suffered like the old American discrimination,
Mm-hmm.
let's just assume that like that discrimination for them was just as bad as it is for black people.
Right, which I don't think that's
Right.
the case, but sure, we'll
Right.
assume.
Yeah. It's probably not the case just because like we didn't enslave them, for example.
Yes.
But like if we assume that, then I think even then we can kind of say like, oh well, there's a reasonable explanation for the reason why we see a difference in Asians and blacks, and I think it really is down to like who is coming in. Like there's African immigrants coming in, there's Asian immigrants coming in, but as a percentage of like the whole population, I was just going over the numbers like a day ago or something like that, but like it's something like it's some crazy like I think it's like more than 50% of the Asians that are in America right now are either like immigrants, like first generation immigrants, or like meaning like they are the people that came over,
Right.
or like the
Their children.
direct descendant, yeah, their children basically.
Yeah.
And but compare that to like black people, like most of the black people that are here now have been here forever. Like they're not Nigerian immigrants. Most of them aren't. A few of them, like some of them are, like some small percentage are Nigerian immigrants, but most of the black people that are here because of like slavery and all that junk.
I mean,
And
I'll
so
have to admit, I understood the black part, but the Asian, that's news to me. I was unaware that 50%. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I didn't. I never heard that.
I don't know the exact. I just know
Right,
it's
right.
like it's a
It's a
huge
big
amount.
percentage.
And like
Okay.
and even if the immigration rates are like equal, because Asians have like a proportionally like smaller part of the population, if we let in just as many people from China as we do from Africa, the people that we let in from China are going to bring up the average more for their community than the people from Africa, because there's just more black people here.
Right.
Like yeah. So basically, like, even if we assume that discrimination experienced by these two groups was like equal back in the day, on the fact, just because of the fact that we let in a lot more Asian immigrants proportionally than black immigrants, and these immigrants are going to be, wealthier than like the average guy in China. Like these aren't subsistence farmers that we're getting into our country. These are like the best and brightest of China, basically.
Okay. I
And
mean,
and the yeah.
yeah, I mean, and I get what you say. I would have to like really delve into that, but I think that other things, like I think that historically and now, even if you leave like genetics out of it, I think that there is a strong kind of collectivist group mindset with Asian cultures that I think that's what helps them outperform whites, and like they. It's just a cultural thing. It's not a genetic thing. Like culturally, a lot of Asian
Right.
families, like they're really important on extracurriculars and things like that. So, but like I like getting back to the race realism thing. So I think, I think your criticism is, well, it's overgeneralized. They don't approach it as scientifically as they should. But what I would say is, I don't think we should demonize too much the idea of we shouldn't even look at it, because we can say, regardless, whatever term you want to use, race or specific people from a specific area, like you're right about the sickle cell thing, right? We can see how that affected genetically, right? And therefore it is worth talking about, at least in that sense. But what is the reason you're talking about that? Well, because we want to cure sickle cell. We want to find out where it comes from and be able to cure it. So it is clear that there can be biological differences that occur from different populations. I agree with you that we definitely overgeneralize and we say, oh, that person looks like that person, therefore they must be in that group. And I don't think that's the case. Now, where it gets difficult is, one, people that use that for racist reasons. Second, you need to be looking at the backgrounds and everything that goes into that, right? Like, is it just genetic, or were there things like poverty led to genetic decrease? Like, for example, if you would take like someone who is a racist and says, well, African Americans are inferior to us because they're less intelligent, they have less IQ. Like, let's take that group then and give them every advantage, like give them millions of dollars and the best education, and maybe there wouldn't be a big difference in IQ the first generation, but maybe it goes up in the second. Then maybe it gets really good in the third, right? And that's getting to what I'm saying is that I think there is a likely probability that things like systemic racism that you were talking about earlier can affect IQ, right? But it's still, I don't think I don't think you're automatically a bigot for saying that the stats are what the stats are. Now, so there's a lot of things that could go into it, and I think the race realists oftentimes want to make the same mistake that I think they criticize the people that talk about systemic racism, where it's just a broad overgeneralization. They just say, it's genetic, that's it. Which I think there's a lot of factors we need to look at. And I think oftentimes it's used for unpure motives, for racial motives, which I don't think is good. But I think you could get into it by saying, it was, as a scientist, I'm just interested and I want to find every reason I can is why it seems certain populations aren't doing as well as others. And I have a little more to say, but go ahead. You can.
Right. So I guess, like, I don't know. I guess in what you're saying, there's kind of the symmetry where you're like, oh, yeah, the race realists are like making the same arguments that they're accusing the systemic racism advocate, or like realists, I guess,
Right.
of making. But like, I guess, like, on the one hand, like, there's no, like, I don't know. There's either no, like, I don't want to say no, but there's like not that many, like, in the sense of that, like, as many scientists as deny climate change, deny, like, or also accept or buy into the race realism thing, like in terms of qualified science. Like I don't think it's like from a scientific perspective,
Well,
is like on
is that
sturdy
true?
ground.
I mean, I thought that, like for example, to leave blacks out of it, and the problem is when you talk groups that are seemingly on the lower end of the spectrum, then it often sounds terrible and bigoted. But if you talk about groups that actually benefit from this, like for example, you hear Asians are really high, Nigerians, Ashkenazi Jews are really high. Like supposedly, just on average, they have more IQ, and I think that's got to be measurable, right? Like
I guess I'm talking about I'm saying like like the scientific community. I don't think there's too many scientists that are going to say that are going to make the following statement, which is like, oh, we can scientifically classify people like based on their genetics into different races, and they'll no one will say like, oh, it's useful scientifically to do this. Like we can elect to do this, and like we can see what happens, but it's kind of like, if I separate people into two groups and one group has people that are above 5 feet and the other group has people that are below 5 feet, and we like do all these tests on them, it won't it just doesn't matter too much. Or if we like do a blue eye, brown eye grouping or something like we might see differences, but because there's no scientific reasoning for our separation, justification to claim that these differences like mean anything.
Well,
like,
and
we can sit. Yeah,
I agree with that, but then if we here is the scientific reason that it might be to do that. Now I'll argue against my point in a minute, but this is something you could say, right? Like you could say, well, wait a minute. I'm just looking at the numbers that we initially were talking about on Twitter last night, where it's like, I'm just looking at the numbers that say blacks are less successful than other races. I'm trying to lay all the cards out on the table why that could be the case. One of those could be genetics, and so that's why I'm looking at this. And so if we're looking, the reason is it doesn't have to be a racist reason. It could be I really want blacks to do better. Now the problem is rarely is that the case. Right? That's rarely the case. And again, I think there's other things that go into that. But then here's even more, and this we've alluded to this several times last night and tonight on this, is how do you define success, right? Because what is the meaning of, not to get philosophical, but what makes a great life? Because we can, without batting an eye, look at certain population, and it's not the entire race, but let me give you an example. Like the percentage of Samoans that are as a very small population that are like in the NFL is absurd. They happen to be really hardy, strong people. Genetically, that's how. Now, there are reasons for it. Is it because they're superior humans? No, it's because, where their ancestors grew up, their way of life led to, their diet, all this stuff led to physically impressive on average, right? And we can say that a lot, start to look at other things that aren't just like that. Like, for example, we could see, disproportionately, we have a lot of incredible black athletes. Now, the question is, does that mean blacks are superior? Is the fact that whites have a higher IQ mean they're superior? No! And there's all kinds of factors that could go into why are blacks and more blacks in the NFL? Is it just genetic? You know what I mean? There's tons, and people the race realists want to oversimplify. And most of them, and I don't know about Charles Murray, but I can honestly say most of them are winking and nodding like, yeah, white people are better. And I think that's an absurd generalization. It's terrible. One, you don't know, like you said, there's broad define white people. What if I just look specifically at a population of people that grew up in rural Kentucky, right? Wouldn't that be more useful to look at that genetic predisposition than looking at, a white person that grew up in rural Kentucky versus who's had 5 generations of poor people that didn't have good education versus a white person that grew up, in San Francisco, or you know what I mean? And so I think that we end up with all sorts of problems. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't necessarily think we should avoid the topic or that there's no reasons to talk about it. I just think they're wrong. That's all. And I think that so many people, we see the argument to them when we just say, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but if we just say, well, you're a bigot, so I don't want to talk about it, we kind of cede the argument to them because then they say, because, and a guy, I'd say he's a racist, Jared Taylor, who's a Richard Spencer buddy, who I would say he's a white nationalist. That's what often happens with him. People just say like, "Wait, you're a bigot." And I saw Sargon of Akkad like debated him. I thought Sargon could have did a better job, but and Sargon got heat, and I was with Sargon because I'm like, no, the way to deal with people that are using these statistics in a racist way isn't to just be like, oh, well, I can't deal with this. Show them how ridiculous it is, and I think there's a lot of argument on that, but it's so tough because there are a lot of people that are arguing in bad faith these things, and there are a lot of people that are afraid to speak up because they're afraid that they'll be called racist and lumped in with the people in bad faith. And then there's a question of why the heck are we even looking at it in the first place? I think that both of us would agree we judge individuals as individuals. So what is the utility of us saying, well, the average IQ of a black person is X? Yes, if we're trying to solve like a problem like systemic poverty, it might be worth discussing, but I don't think by any means it's one of the predominant factors. There's tons of other factors. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Yeah, one of the things that I remember from that David Pakman video on race realism is like basically the only like good way it seems to be able to apply the knowledge that black people have lower IQ on average is to say, oh, well, black people have a lower IQ and we don't believe it's genetic, so therefore we should probably like put some money into the black communities to get their environment better so that like they stop having this lower IQ. Mm-hmm. But then like if that is the conclusion that you reach because you're assuming that it's not genetic, then it's like, well, that's what people already want to do. People already want to kind of fix up black communities like without even resorting to IQ. So and not just that, but like when people like are critiquing, like when people critique, like people on the left or whatever critique like race realists, they're not like saying like, oh, you have all of this meaningful data and you're doing bad stuff with it. They're saying like, what they're saying is like, this data that you have is actually not even meaningful. Like it doesn't really matter that we know that Samoans or whatever have that there are a lot more Samoans in the NFL. Like I don't know. I haven't looked up any Samoan data or anything.
It's weird. I just happened to see it once on ESPN. I was like, wow, that's crazy. I never realized that.
Right. Like we have no clue like why that is. Like maybe like every Samoan at birth as part of their culture is like pushed around and roughed around. Like I really doubt that it's like just a genetic thing. But like it's just like it's not. I feel like it's not too useful because like everything that we see in terms of race, we see in terms of like the socially constructed, right? Like I know people don't like to say like socially constructed like ever, like especially like Jordan Peterson who hates that word. But like it, race in a certain like so you're either like a race realist or you buy into race being socially constructed in the sense that the reason we say, oh, these people are black and these people are white is because there's no actual like definition of what it means to be white or black. Like we could, those definitions can change and they have changed like throughout history. Like I don't know if you're familiar with this happening, but like way back in like the early days of America, a bunch of the founding fathers were like super anti like almost every other European based on like race. Like they were like, oh, these Germans, they're too dark skinned for us.
The Irish, like, right?
Yeah. Irish, Irish, like they were
the Blazing Saddles joke, right? It's like we'll take the blacks, but we don't want the Irish. Yeah, that's one of my favorite jokes.
yeah, but and basically like that's the thing. Like the reason why like these labels are so like meaningless is because they've changed so much in like such recent history. Like it used to be that English people didn't consider Germans to be white, and how funny is that the Germans like in the 1900s would become like Nazis who think they're superior to everybody. Like everybody thinks they're superior. Like that's always like that's just how it is.
Right. Well, but I agree with that. I think you're right, but I would say I don't understand why you couldn't then apply the same logic to kind of the conversation on systemic racism, saying like, well, blacks are doing worse off successfully. And, because you could say, well, the definition changes. Instead, we should look at what does it mean to be black? Are we talking someone who's an ancestor of slave? Why is the skin hue the important thing, right?
I guess that's the thing is that like I think they are kind of two different things. So like I was kind of trying to say this earlier. I think I got sidetracked. by myself.
Well,
But like it, but basically on the one hand you have race realist positions, which are like not really like and when I say race realist again, I'm saying like the belief that you can like scientifically justify the classification of people into like black, white, whatever. And I don't think that too many scientists, like practicing scientists who like produce work in the field of whatever we want, are kind of buy into that. I don't think most scientists would say like, oh yeah, there's like we have these groupings of people into black, white, and whatever. It's like it's scientifically okay to like have it like this. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of like social scientists and economists. Like you gave some counterexamples last night, but I think there's a lot that buy into this whole systemic discrimination thing. And you're right that like the metric of what it means to be successful kind of changes over time, but like more or less like we can say stuff like, oh well, you know, Buddhist monks and all that, like they own no possessions and yet they're like really happy.
Sure.
But like I think everyone should kind of be on the same page. If we're talking about like America in the 21st century or even the 20th century, like access to electricity, cell phone, car, etc.
Sure.
Like all those are like pretty reasonable measurements in my mind. And I think for the purpose of like analyzing the problem, you know, that exists right now, I think it's like I think it's like okay to have those, like it's okay for those things to change because we're not claiming that they're immutable. But the race realists are claiming that there are these immutable characteristics. It's our DNA that is, you know, setting us up. It's like this super deterministic position or something like that. So I don't think the two situations are like strictly analogous or anything like that. I think one of them has like a lot of science behind it and the other one kind of doesn't.
Well, yeah, and I agree with you in the sense that like I reject determinism completely. Like, but I think that let me put it this way. I think that it's not an either or situation. I think that you could believe that genetics has something to do with it, and then social construct has something to do with it. The question is, where do you draw the line and how much? And the question is, what do you do with that information? Again, I don't think. I guess maybe we're having different definitions of what race realist is, but I don't think that it's totally a fruitless endeavor to say, I'm trying to figure out all the factors into why a particular group has a particular level of success. And so I'm going to look at the culture. I'm going to look at things like systemic racism and institutions that have affected them because of their race. I'm going to look at all those things. I think that we can clearly see that regardless of how you want to put it, I do think that a scientist, I don't know if we have this technology now, but I think that in the future, you would be able to look and say, we understand this genetic code is, you know, the same species as this one, but we could say that this group here is closer connected than this group here. Call that race, call it whatever you want. And you could see differences in that genetic code. There are certainly genetic differences. The question is, what do you do with that information? How much does that information, like, because if you start to use this deterministically, well, then that's racism, right? If you just say, this person is a failure because of their genetic code, because of how they're born, that is disgusting, right? And to me, the irony is that the people that are making these types of arguments make the exact opposite argument when they're talking about things like systemic racism. They say in that type of argument, they say like, oh, no, there's no proof that this is just systemic racism. We should judge people as individuals, not judge them as a group. Now, I get what you're saying. I think that there are more people that are willing to talk about like the idea of systemic racism existing. And no doubt it has. I won't deny that. It certainly has. I mean, how could you deny that Jim Crow or slavery wasn't systemic racism? Clearly it was. The question you have to ask then, how much does that have an effect today? And I think it's also fair to say, how much do genetics have today? But as someone who believes in individualism, it's irrelevant to me in the grand scheme of how do we act in day-to-day life? How do you treat people? How do you judge people? You judge them as an individual, right? Like, you might say, like, let's take race out of it for a minute. You might just say, hey, Rob's a pretty heavy-set guy. I bet he could eat a lot of food. But that's irrelevant. Like, if I can't eat a lot of food, then I can't. So to go through life, and the problem is many of the race realists out themselves because that's all they want to focus on. Which shows you, anytime you start to say you were born a certain way, you're only a stone's throw away of saying, and that makes you superior or inferior. And we have had experiments of what that leads to. That's what the Nazi Germany experiment was, right? Like, we're the perfect race. And so you do have to be very careful. But I guess all I'm trying to say is, although I have huge disagreements, and I think that it is way oversimplified to just say, this race has this IQ, some of the reasons you've said, where it's like, we overgeneralize. What are you talking about? You could slice what the race is in different ways. Like, instead of race, we could slice it by state, right? Well, what's the IQ of people that happen to be born in Kentucky versus people that happen to be in Pennsylvania? There's probably a difference, right? It's probably measurable. On average, you could probably find the average IQ of people in Kentucky versus people in... You know what I'm saying? So it's like, what is the utility of making this about race? I get it if you're just looking for all answers possible, but I think that in good faith, there are tons of better answers for why there are discrepancies in success level of different races than genetics. That is way down the list. Things like culture, things like poverty, things like even, I would say, systemic racism, at least as much as genetics have to do with it. And so the people that want to make the IQ argument, they act like that's the end-all be-all. Your IQ's this, and you're deterministic, that's what you're stuck with. And I don't buy that crap at all. But I'm not saying that everyone who has ever looked at these things is automatically a racist. I know it's a weird position to have, but... I
know what you mean. And, there's a whole bunch of people that kind of, like, fall in a lot of different places on this. Like, and I don't know, like, if you ever end up watching a Destiny thing, you'll kind of see a contrast between like how he speaks about this and how I speak about it, because he is a lot more forceful. Like, right. I'm not being anything sure. Like, but basically, like, there's people that, like, I don't know. I don't really know what Christina Hoff Sommers thinks about, like, race. I'm pretty sure she's kind of like in the race realist type camp. I'm not sure, like, not your definition, but like my definition, where like she believes that, like, it makes sense scientifically to, like, classify people into these 5 races or whatever like that. Mm-hmm. But, like, people like her, like, I don't think she has, like, qualification to make a judgment. Like, I don't think she did the research required to actually, like, come to her own consensus about it in a scientifically informed fashion. Like, it's not like she did any sort of, like, peer-reviewed study and came out with some results, and it's not like she cross-compared it against all the other stuff going on in the field. Like, there's people like that are just like, that just aren't informed. But
now, I don't know about, I can't speak to whether she is or not, but I agree with you that this is such a subject that has such a propensity for racism to come out of it, that you should probably not be making definitive claims unless you're really objectively, scientifically looking at the data. Right. And I would argue 95% of the people aren't, right? They're just spouting their mouth off, and it ends up leading to a lot of harm. I agree with that 100%.
Right. Well, one of the best examples of this is, like, it's actually a really good example. So one of the guys that discovered DNA, like the fact that it's a double helix, is this guy named James Watson. I think it's James Watson anyway.
Okay.
And he infamously said in like 2009 or maybe it was the 1980s, I forget. It was multiple times, but he infamously...
You cut out on me.
He infamously said, like, oh yeah, I think that, I think that there is a definite genetic cause behind IQ differences in race. Like, he said this, and he is the guy who discovered DNA, and he won the Nobel Prize for that. And and he got, like, raked through the mud about this, not because it was, and a lot of people like the IDW type people might kind of defend him and be like, hey, you shouldn't be taking away this guy's awards and stuff like that. But, like, the reason that people kind of really didn't like it when this guy, who was the discoverer of DNA, said that, is because, like, there's this thing called appeal to an authority, which you actually cited, which is basically like saying, it's a fallacy where you say, like, one realization is, I'm an authority on X, therefore I can say something about Y. So, like, Watson wasn't, like, an expert on IQ,
right,
or intelligence or any of this stuff. He just discovered DNA. Like, that's his thing. It's not IQ, and yet he came out and said, like, definitively like, oh, genetics, that's the main reason behind the differences in IQ. And because he has a Nobel Prize, like a lot of people would take him at his word and think like, oh, he's the super respected scientist, like
Right.
believe him.
Yeah, and I get you. Like, I do get that. And I don't know. Like, I have to claim ignorance on, like, is Christina Hoff Sommers or is Stefan Molyneux? My guess is Stefan Molyneux may not be as informed as he should be. But I don't know. I don't know. I guess the only thing I can say about it is, if you're going to talk about these, and I will tell you, I right now will never make definitive claims on IQ and race because I have no interest in it. I think there's an easy propensity for it to be exploited in bad ways, and I'm not a scientist, and it's a subject that you should be very careful with approaching because it's very nuanced and it's very easy to exploit. But, to me it's similar. Take race out of it. There's an interesting, like, nature versus nurture conversation. Have you ever seen that? Now they're saying that, like, you could do a CAT scan on someone and you could see, like, lesions in the brain that could determine whether or not you have a propensity to, like, be a serial killer and stuff like that. The problem, like, which I believe that could, from what I've seen, that seems like there are actual legitimate people, not for nefarious reasons, looking at this and having a data set. But the propensity to exploit that and be like, aha, you were born with this brain lesion, therefore we treat you like future crime or something, right? You can't do that. Like, the negatives far outweigh any potential safety we would get from doing that. And so I kind of feel the same way with this, like, race realism thing, where it's like, okay, what do you want us to do with this? Like, even if you're right, like, I'm not calling you a racist, even if you're right about this, what do you want us to do? And like I said, oftentimes people that, like, your Jared Taylors of the world will say, I don't know if you've ever seen Jared Taylor, he's got this, like, Hank Hill, like, where he pronounces, like, the H real heavy on the word white. He'll be like, I'm just saying that white community. Like, it's so ridiculous. But, it's like, why would you say that? Why wouldn't you say, I want people of a certain... Because what they're saying is, oh, well, IQ's what really matters, right? And we don't want people below a certain threshold of IQ. Okay, then wouldn't you say we want a country of people with this IQ? No. You switch it to race. Why is that? Because the IQ doesn't matter. That's just an excuse. You're trying to make your bigotry sound scientific. That's, to me, what it is.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of people even are, like, I don't know if you know this, but, like, there's like a long history in science of people trying intentionally to use science to justify, like, racism and the inferiority. Like it dates back to, like, the 1800s. People were, like, measuring people's skulls because there was this huge belief among a bunch of scientists at the time that, like,
phrenology,
you can determine somebody's, like, basically worth based on, like, skull measurements, and it's, like, complete BS. Like, today we know it's complete BS, and back then they would have known if they were being honest that it's complete BS. And, like, that it's I'm not saying that it's like using Sam Harris's kind of, like, metric of absurdity or whatever, like, where he said he's an atheist, right? And so he'll say like, oh, Christians are crazy, but Mormons are even more crazy because, like, XYZ. Basically, like, phrenologists are, like, super duper crazy, but the race realists, like, they're not as crazy, but they're still, like, it's kind of like race realists today are kind of like what phrenologists were back in their day, and they're not being, like, honest about it. And so basically everybody who, like, kind of says, everybody who's repeating the stuff that race realists say about how, like, it's really important that we look at, like, IQ differences among race and all this other stuff. Like, the people that repeat those talking points are kind of, like, just like, they're just saying really spread it. Like, I don't know how much you follow the whole, like, dog whistle-y type stuff, but, like, ever since I started watching, like, people like Pac-Man and Destiny and stuff, I've kind of been exposed to the concept that there's a lot of people out there that'll kind of just eat what you feed them. And if you feed them, like, a bunch of racist stuff, as long as it's covered in sugar, they'll eat it too. And they'll become, people that will say all the racist stuff that like racist people say, except they'll be like, "What? I'm not a racist. Like, how can you say that I'm a racist?"
But okay,
Yeah.
to rip on that, and I agree with that. Real
Uh-huh.
quick, I'll say something. This is a total aside. And I didn't want
Right.
to delve deep in, but
No,
theoretically, you could have been a phrenologist who wasn't a racist. You could have just been like, I think the shape of skulls means something. I'm going to investigate it. The problem was that field, one, we know is nonsense, but second, was quickly taken over by the race exploiters. Completely taken over. So, but that's just an aside. But I agree with what you're saying.
I don't know the I don't know the history. Like, I don't know who was the first phrenologist, but it might have been like from the very beginning that somebody said, like these African people are freaking like inferior as hell. Like, look at them, they're slaves.
That would be my guess. My guess would be it was an excuse to say there's a difference. But I'm just saying you could have been ignorant of that and just said, yes, I'm interested in. I don't know. There's a movie called Men at Work, stars Charlie Sheen and Emilio, where they're garbage men. And at one point they break into this woman's house and he's like, oh yeah, because he wants to like rub her head. He's like, I'm a phrenologist. I'm studying the. He probably wasn't doing that for. But you know what? I'm just a weird joke. I don't know why I remember that. But anyways, when you're talking about experts exploiting things for, I agree. So like you could have people in the field of race realism, which I will agree with you also, is by no means considered as mainstream or legitimate as people talking about systemic racism. But I think, again, the same problem can apply in that crowd. And I'll use David. Now, I haven't seen a lot of David Pakman videos, but one of the ones I saw was just from the other day, and it kind of went viral, where this girl calls into a show and is like,
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm going to say, where she's like, well, you can't be racist towards whites. Because racism is racism plus power. And that's nonsense. Right. And Pakman, to his credit, was like, this is nonsense. But where Pakman's wrong is he's like, this is a fringe belief. It's not. That belief is rampant in academia. And what happens is it is like feeding people this sugar. People exploit it, and instead of just, I'm not saying everyone, and I'm not even saying the majority, but there are a lot of people in positions of institutional power, particularly in places like academia, but we also see it in the political world, that seek to weaponize to say, the problem is the patriarchy. The problem is men being in control of stuff. The problem is white people. And it's like, it is thinly veiled racism. There are people that are using that to go after groups that they don't like. And, I could liken it to this. George Orwell wrote a book. If you follow Jordan Peterson, he's talked about this. Orwell wrote a book called The Road to Wigan Pier. They used to do books like they were called serials, where you'd put out one chapter a week in the local magazine. So he was paid by these socialists to go in and write this book about the terrible lives of these coal miners. And it was just hell. Like, this work was brutal. And so the first half of the book's just him in detail explaining how horrible it is to be a coal miner in this UK, or I guess it would have been Britain at the time. I don't know. UK city or whatever. I'm not good with that history. But the second half of it was he was arguing, I can't shake the feeling that these socialists, it's not so much that they like the poor, it's that they hate the people that they perceive. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of that in this questions of systemic racism, where you could see it's dog whistling, it's palpable, like, I think that we need revenge on men, or I think that we need revenge on the white people, or something like that. Now, that's not everyone, and that's no reason to throw out the entire discipline. But I think in the same way, there is a lot of people, and those people do occupy a lot of positions of power in academia, in the political world, even in places like social media and in places like Silicon Valley. I mean, it's how it's weaponized to go after censoring people that say things like men can't be women, which that feminist said, I forget her name. And it's like, you can tell that that's not about a serious conversation of being like, well, wait, let's talk about, that's like, get those people. We want to attack the people we disagree with.
Right. Yeah. So I guess with regards to that, like, I don't know. I used to, like, I was, and I kind of still am in a certain sense, but not really. Like, kind of like really big into Jordan Peterson stuff. Like, he's a pretty cool guy, and I like a lot of the stuff that he's saying. But I think that even he kind of falls victim to this general phenomenon of like he's the thing that actually, if you're gonna watch one thing from Destiny, watch him and David Pakman talk. It's like a really good talk.
Okay.
That just that's the best way to, because that's how I actually got introduced to Destiny, and it was like a perfect introduction. They kind of go over the whole IDW, I think, as well, and kind of lay out their opinions, I think. But just so that you can kind of know what they think, I guess. But anyway, like oh shit, what was I talking about? Dang it.
You were just talking about Jordan Peterson, Pac-Man and Destiny.
Oh right, yeah. So like Jordan, one of the things that Destiny and Pac-Man kind of go over in their conversation together is that there's this thing that happens where like people can be good at the thing that they're good at. So like Sam Harris is really good at his like meditation crap and his like brain psychology type of stuff. I shouldn't say meditation crap. It's like legit.
Right.
And then and Jordan Peterson is really good at his like, you know, self-help, the psychology, you know, the stuff that he does research in and went to school for. But like all of this extra stuff that both of them like talk about, like they're technically not experts in those fields. Like they're kind of, I mean, they're not exactly like you and me. They have PhDs. They're a little bit more, but they're not. They also didn't go to school for years and spend time studying, like per se. I mean, Jordan Peterson did do a bunch of studying for like some of the stuff, like his Marxism stuff. I mean, and I don't know exactly what he gets right and wrong, but like basically, their biggest criticism that I've kind of adopted of Jordan Peterson is like like his 12 rules for life. You know, he has like a whole bunch of his kind of ideology embedded in the book, but you don't actually need the ideology to get the rules. Like the rules are pretty straightforward, like without the ideology. And like basically, I don't know, it's kind of like why would and I'll preface this by just saying like I still do really like Jordan Peterson, but like why would we like listen to him speak about stuff that he's not, you know, per se qualified to speak about? Like I totally understand like when you say stuff like, oh, you know, there's all this academic, you know, bias and all this stuff going on, all of the grievance studies and Peter Boghossian and all that stuff, but like that's on the one hand, but on the other hand, I really don't think there's much. And even when you talk to like, or even when you listen to Jonathan Haidt, you know, he'll be confronted because he's kind of the guy that started this whole college thing. You know, even Jonathan Haidt will be like, well, it's not a problem at most colleges. It's just the big ones. They're like just like the Ivy League ones or something like that. And so it's like, you know, there's this whole heterodox academy thing and all that. But like, I think the problems that Jordan Peterson sees in academia are not as prevalent as he lets it on to be. Like, I don't think there's this grand, like, giant, you know, power looming over everybody and not forcing, but just like, you know, influencing Silicon Valley and all that. Like, I think the people at Google are mostly driven by money. Like, they want to make money just like everybody else, and they're super rich, so they really want to make money. And like, I think they wouldn't do something if they didn't think it would make them a ton of money. Well, so like, whenever they block people, like I know people like Tim Pool and Jordan Peterson, all that will say like, oh, it's because they want to silence conservatives. But like, I really just think it has to do with some sort of broader economic, like, you know, it's not that they're blocking conservatives. It's that doing whatever they did just made them a bunch of money in their eyes.
Well, I think you could say that in the whole scale to an opinion or to an extent, right? You could say that at the end of the day it's about money, or money might be slightly off, though it's basically the same thing, or power, you know. But the money is power, basically. But you know, so in some instances, pandering to who you think will be the political group in power, you might lose some money, but it is about you ultimately getting more power, which is basically interchangeable with money. So you're sacrificing some short-term money for long-term money because you think it'll be the politically expedient position and get you more popularity in the future. But that I'll say that's probably there's probably a good bit of that going on at these companies, but I don't think that necessarily applies to the individuals that operate in academia or operate in these companies. And the problem is that a lot of, like, if we were talking about systemic racism, they talk about like things like unconscious bias and unconscious racism, right? I think there's a lot of unconscious bias, like for the people. You see the Tim Pool, Joe Rogan episode where Jack Dorsey's on there, and basically Dorsey admits like, okay, a lot of this censorship's not like Twitter's coming down saying, let's censor conservatives. It's that basically everyone at my company who makes input on who to censor is very liberal. But that's just a result of that happens to be the people that got into this field, because that happens to be the people that came from academia. And I think it's the same in academia. I don't think that like a school like Harvard sets out to say like, we have this ideology that we want to present. We want to be a left-wing ideology. The problem is that they have let things go for so long that things, and this is what, and I'll just stick to the Ivy Leagues for now. This is what Jonathan Haidt's talking about, where he says, the shift has been incredible. It's almost exponential, where it used to be maybe 60, 70% of your faculty and administration were left or far left-wing, and now it's like 90. And that means, you know, the shift from 4 and 7 to 9 and 10 is incredible. It's incredible. And we see then, as that shift occurs, that means that the students then adapt those ideologies more likely, which means they then get into being professors, which means that, or administrators, which it kind of, it's a ball that keeps rolling. And that's why we could see, even though universities have always been somewhat left-wing by the nature of it, you didn't see like, you know, I mean, for God's sakes, Berkeley's the foundation of free speech. They're now censoring anyone that they, you know, that they, a bunch of people that they think are right-wing. Now, you might say, well, how much of a problem is it? I argue that I think, but regardless of the motivation, that we have, I don't agree with that girl that called in the David Pakman show that says, well, you can only be racist if you have power. That's ridiculous. Though, if you have power, your racism is more effectual. I do agree with that. But anyways, right. I think that, so the damning thing to me is, right now we have all these cultural institutions that kind of shape our public discourse and public opinion. And these institutions are like academia, they're the mainstream media, they're the entertainment industry, they're Silicon Valley, and they're all predominantly establishment left-wing. And that's the narrative they're putting forward. Now, you could say, but wait a minute, they're not pushing ideologies, they're just trying to make money. Maybe it is just to make money, but that's the ideology they're pushing. And this ends up, that's why you end up seeing people are kind of put in a corner, because if you can't speak, if you don't have a voice that's really heard in the public dialogue, well, that's why you get all these right-wing trolls, you get the memes, you get all the right-wing YouTube people. And I don't mean just the far right, screw them, like screw the identitarians. Identitarianism's wrong to me, whether it be right or left wing. I have no love for any of the right-wing identitarians. But I feel like that's what's happening. Is it a result of, you know, the mainstream media saying we are consciously going to be left-wing? Or is it a result of years of, you got people that got in that field that were somewhat left-wing, which encouraged more left-wing people to get in the field that are slightly more left-wing, etc. I don't know. Right. But it's evident to me that these people, whether it be for monetary reasons only or for ideological reasons, I mean, it's not just conservatives they're censoring, or that their voice they're not hearing. Like I said, people like Glenn Greenwald or Jimmy Dore or Aaron Mattei, these are huge progressives that feel like, hey, we can't get into the public discourse. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a complicated situation. What? Yeah, I agreed. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think it's a complicated situation, and I definitely think like there is definitely some like bias, like kind of in the Jack Dorsey way, like individuals are biased, but I don't think like companies per se are. And like I don't know, a lot of people have. It's just a very complicated, like it's a complicated thing in general, and like we mortals here are just we're not even like, you know, Jordan Peterson or any of these other people. Right. Like we don't even have expertise in a single thing. Like we don't. Yeah. But we could finish. What? We could finish on this, but I mean, we could still go a couple more minutes. But you know, don't sell yourself short, though. I think that you have. See, sometimes, and we were talking about this last, and it's very difficult because it's nuanced. It depends on what you're talking about. We used to deal about this in debate. So if I could just give a real quick rundown of debate. Sure. Like if you had a debate argument, you would have, this is a gross oversimplification, but you would have arguments called like disadvantage. A disadvantage would be, okay, you enact your plan. Here's a negative consequence that was, maybe you would say was not foreseeable. So let's say your plan is, we want to get rid of fossil fuels because it'll solve global warming. Well, why is that bad? That's called the impact. Well, the impact is global warming could kill a lot of people, right? Okay, so a disadvantage would be something that doesn't do with global warming, but something negative that could happen to that plan. And a disadvantage needs, this is oversimplifying, but basically 3 points. The first point's called uniqueness, which means the way things are now. The second thing's called the link. How does your plan affect the way things are now? And the third part's called the impact. Why is that bad, or how do we quantify how bad that is? So I might say, well, your plan to eliminate fossil fuels, the uniqueness is the economy's doing great now. The link is your plan would crush the economy. And the impact is that could lead to a war, right? That's basically how that works. So when we're talking about things like, where was I going with it? I can tell it's going to be 12:20 at night. But right. when we're talking about these companies then that are censor, or when we're talking about expertise and things like that, like we have to understand that there is an ability for us to be able to point out this stuff and have a general understanding that sometimes we could see through things that maybe the expert can't see. If you're too specialized in a field, oftentimes you don't see unintended consequences, and sometimes laymen like us are able to see through that. I really recommend, if there's one person I could recommend you watch, it would be Jimmy Dore. It's not that he's the most brilliant person in the world, but he's funny. But that's one of the things that's great about it. He constantly says, why do I have to repeat that? Or why do I have to be the one reporting on this? I'm just some schmuck comedian. I don't know anything. I don't know as much as Chris Cuomo. I don't know as much as Anderson Cooper or Rachel Maddow. They're all smarter than me. But he's like, I'm a comedian. I have a BS detector. I could say, like, because comedians are kind of experts in, like, social observation. And I think that sometimes, you know, there are unintended, like that's what I was saying about there are unintended positions from, like, you know, a scientist might, or an expert might have an opinion on the field, but people like us, I would never say, this is what I was going to say about that. When you're talking about uniqueness, the way things are now, generally speaking, that type of argument, you want someone who has more expertise. So, like, if I just said, hey, the economy's going great, who do you trust, me or someone that's like, I've been an economist at the Wall Street Journal or at, you know, the New York Academy for 30 years. Like, yeah, that guy probably. But when you start to get to kind of the impact statements and things like that, all of a sudden the expertise means less. You know, so it's like, I don't have to be an expert to say, yeah, the economy crashing is a bad thing. And so I'm just trying to say it's different. There some things, and it's very nuanced. We should approach it on a case-by-case basis. But some things, I will concede that it's more important to be an expert than others. Race realism, for an example. Some guy just flapping his gums at the bar about why his race is superior. Shut your mouth. You don't know anything, right? But there are other subjects where just general life experience and not being an expert, so you might have input. So it's very complicated. I'm not saying that experts should never, you know, don't have any more clout than laymen, but I think that people like us, and the other thing is, right, there needs to be a connection between experts and between people that have no understanding of the issue at all. And oftentimes experts have a very difficult time of articulating to the general public what they're trying to say. So people like me or you that maybe are, you know, we're not completely ignorant of the subject, but we could look at it and be like, okay, I got some understanding. We're able to be a bridge for people that's like, okay, I can't understand listening to Sam Harris talk about the difficult concepts he's talking about, but I got one basic thoughts on what we're talking kind of a little about. I just got a general understanding. Of course, they should go to Sam Harris to really get exactly what he's saying. But I think that we serve utility, and we could be correct in a lot of our positions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I mostly agree with that. I mean, I'm not trying to like downplay my expertise or your expertise. I mean, I'm trying to get informed on all this stuff, just like you are and everyone else is. It's just like, I don't know. I just want to keep myself and generally other people too from like trying to put themselves off as like an expert on everything. Like I feel like people like Jordan Peterson sometimes like kind of puts himself off as like an expert on absolutely everything. Like, and people who listen to him will say everything he says with as much certainty as he says it, even if he's not even like that knowledgeable about it. I think it's just sometimes it's like okay to like that leap and be an expert. Stuff that the experts say, but sometimes it's just not, and I just want to make sure that I'm careful not to misjudge that.
And I guess what I was trying to say last night is, to me, let's say I'm an expert on some. I don't even know what I would be an expert on.
Right.
I used to be an expert on Mario Tennis for Mario 64. I thought I was a fantastic player, right? But like, as an expert on that, I would be willing to say, hey, I'll listen to the layman, but I'm so confident that I'm right in my position that, sure, I'll have it out with you. Or I don't mean have it out in a bad way. I mean, like, yeah, we'll have a discussion about it, and I'll win that 99% of the time. But there still could be stuff that could be added, and there are certain times when, like, let me just give you an example. This is anecdotal, and I know it doesn't prove anything, but one of the things in debate, it was so left-wing that, if you're a debate judge, you always want to be the smartest person in the room. Sometimes you'd have 3 judges in a room, right? And the first judge would say, oh, I vote for this team because of X. And then the second judge would be like, well, I vote for this team because of X and Y. Like this one-upsmanship, like, well, I'm smarter than you. And sometimes you could be so smart that you end up being dumb. So, like, if I could give you an example, and this is going to sound really stupid, but you want to see what a policy debate looks like? I would stand up to read a piece of evidence, and I'm just going to start reading from the message board here, right? It would be something like this. You becoming an expert by writing all competitive specific theses that come into the value of things that are not credible to anyone who knows that 20 years ago the group of major persons concerned with right-wing academics those who believe the absolute truth. We talk like that because what happened was, right, when you talk a little faster, you get more arguments. But then the next generation, they could get even faster. That's slow. The people that I debated that had been doing it, going to private schools, doing it for 10 to 12 years, I couldn't understand them. I literally couldn't. So this is supposed to be, and I'm debating Harvard and Yale and Northwestern and all these Ivy League schools that are so smart, and they were incredibly intelligent people. You'd walk in the room, if you're someone on the street, you'd be like, my goodness, they've been in this bubble so long, this is total nonsense. And not just that, you would end up with arguments that were like, you were trying to be so smart that you came off as stupid. So like I remember judging around once where everyone was like, a deep philosophical conversation on how words have no meaning. And I'm like, both sides are agreeing to this. I'm like, it's not just that words can have fluid meanings. It is, there's no meaning. Right? And so like at the end of the day, I'm like, I don't even know how to decide this round. Because you both concede to this argument, which means that everything you've said to me is meaningless. And so, like, you're so smart that it doesn't, and like the layman, sometimes it takes the layman to come in and be like, whoa, do you realize what you're doing? And the example I was going to give is, we went to this, not me, but someone who was on my team went to this tournament, and it was just crazy. No one was arguing the topic. People are they're doing what's called performance. Like, you play the national anthem while you burn the American flag, or, you start walking around with candles while you're reciting poetry. And, like, everything's getting crazier and crazier. Our team decided what they were going to do was they had this parrot that they got that swore at you when you pressed it, like a stuffed parrot. So it would say, like, eat shit, when you'd post it. Every time someone would ask a question, they would respond with the parrot. Then one of them put a garbage can on their head and started beating it with a wooden spoon, while the other one started talking about Donald Rumsfeld owned the company that developed aspartame that's in Diet Coke, and that it was all big conspiracy theory to give us all cancer so Donald Rumsfeld could get rich. They won every debate. They argued that, and every judge was like, I get it. I get the spiritual meaning. What you're trying to say, it's like Foucault. And it's like, oh my goodness, like, you're an expert on, like, postmodernism and philosophy and debate, but you just needed some normal person. Because at the end of that tournament, they told all those judges, no, we're just morons. There was no point to the argument. Or, maybe an easier example for people to understand is, like, sometimes art, you're an art expert and you end up talking about, like, this toilet on the wall, this is how it's, how meaningful it is. So, sometimes the experts get to, and by the way, it happens on all sides. Noam Chomsky, he's a professor of linguistics. Yeah, he's most known for commenting on foreign policy. So, I mean, does that mean we shouldn't listen to him on foreign policy? I don't know. It's very complicated, but I'm not an auctioneer, by the way, whoever asked that.
An auctioneer.
Yes. Well, I'll say this. We should probably wrap up. I should get some sleep tonight since we were up late last night talking.
Yeah.
But just a couple things I wanted to say. One, there were people that were expressing, my buddy Drone Tech was expressing interest on you possibly doing his show. So if you want, I can get a hold of you tomorrow just if you would be interested in that. He usually does live streams 7 o'clock on Saturday. that I join them with. And I thought this was a great conversation. I thought it went really well, and
Awesome.
it was like, it's so rare to have people, we don't agree on everything, but we're like, you're civil about it. Like, I think that that's fantastic, and you gave me a lot of stuff to ponder and look into. And if you ever do start your own channel and your own recordings, let me know. I'll do whatever I can to promote it, and I really appreciate you coming on. But you can have the last word if there's anything.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It was really enjoyable. I really enjoyed it. I've never done this type of thing before. I would definitely like to follow up with you on getting on that other show that you mentioned, and let me know what you think about I guess about Destiny, because
I will.
He's really aggressive with his stuff. So
it's spelled like it sounds, like just the,
okay. The word Destiny.
Okay.
He's a Twitch streamer, but his YouTube channel is where all his stuff is, and it's usually appropriately labeled, so you can just pick your thing. But definitely watch that one interview with David Pakman and Destiny from this year.
Okay.
There's an older one, but this year's one is like really good.
Okay, I will do that. And hopefully, regardless if you ever do that other channel, hopefully we could do this again sometime. I would love to do it. I thought it was a blast, and I learned a lot. So.
Yeah, that would be great. And I'll check out this Jimmy Dore guy, and I'll
yeah.
what I think about it.
So, if everyone, if you're watching, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you can. I'm trying, and I guess I could tell you this as well, Basic Thoughts. Like, I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, because YouTube now has a rule where you can't live stream through mobile if you don't have 1,000 subscribers. And I would like to go to some events, because I'm like trying to get involved in politics. I'd like to go to some events where I get to speak, like at a Republican convention or something. It'd be cool to live stream that. But I can't do it because I don't have 1,000 subscribers. So I'm really trying to get that. But and just so I don't know, one of the weird things, I don't know if people I realize this when I do Drone Tech Show. Can you see the chat, Basic, while we're talking?
Not in our
right,
hangout,
because you're just kind of watching our Google Hangout. Yeah. So just so you know, everyone had. I mean, obviously some people disagreed with some things, but everyone had really positive things to say about you and said that it was awesome that you came on. So I think that. Jimmy Dore used to be Young Turk Rational for asking that. But so I think this went really well. So we'll end the live stream here. Thank you, and I'll talk to you just for a quick second after we end it here. So
all right.
See you, everyone.